The man known to history as Matthew Hopkins, who would famously become known as the Witchfinder General, was born in Great Wenham, in Suffolk, in England, around the year 1620. He cannot have been born before 1619, as a document in which his father was bequeathed a Bible by a deceased parishioner from that year lists Matthew's father's living sons at that time, and Matthew is not listed amongst them. Matthew's father was James Hopkins. James served as the vicar of St. John's Church in Wenham. His will, which was validated in 1634, lists him as having 6 children, but names only 2, Thomas and James, and it seems likely they were the elder children and adults by 1634. The will conversely assigned the care of the remaining 4 children to his widow, which is in line with Matthew still being a minor at that time. This also indicates that Matthew was almost certainly in his mid-20s during his active years as Witchfinder General from 1645 to 1647. There is no indication of what Matthew's mother's name was, though it is clear that she gave birth to and raised numerous children, while it seems plausible, given the high infant mortality rates at the time, that 1 or 2 of her children would not have survived into their adult years, on top of the 6 that seemingly did. From amongst these siblings, we know that Matthew's brother, John, became the minister of South Fembridge near Rochford in 1645, but was removed in 1646, apparently for the neglect of his work. Aside from these details concerning Matthew's family, we have practically no information about Hopkins' early life, though we can conjecture what sort of life he would have led in the small settlement of Wenham. Even today, the village, which lies between Colchester and Ipswich, has a population of less than 200 people. Life would have been characterized by a blend of agricultural work, community interdependence, religious observance, and concern about illness, disease, and injury, with some limited proto-industrial activity in the form of cloth working, smithing, and the like. Most villagers would spend their time farming, with common crops including wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Livestock such as sheep, cows, pigs, and chickens were also vital for sustenance and trade. Homes were basic and would be cold and damp in the winter and stifling in the summer months. The plague and other diseases were endemic in England, meaning that periodic outbreaks were common. Communities were close, and the threats facing early modern villages numerous. It was into this world that Matthew Hopkins was born and raised. In the absence of any further information about his youth, we can only assume that he remained in communities with this sort of lifestyle and economy until further records show his activities as a witch hunter many years later. He does not appear as a student on any existing matriculation list for an English educational institution, though he later claimed to have acquired some legal training in the Netherlands in his youth, and many people who worked in the courts in early modern times were not fully trained lawyers, but more like clerks with informal experience of the courts. The fame of Matthew Hopkins stems almost entirely from the final 3 years of his life, between 1644 and 1647, when he became infamous for his onslaught against those who he claimed were engaged in witchcraft in England. Thus, in the absence of any major details concerning his life up to his mid-20s, we should reflect on the nature of the society he lived in and the place of witchcraft and witch hunting within it, as these are critical to Matthew's story. By the time of Hopkins' birth around 1620, England and Europe as a whole was in the midst of a period of substantial economic, social and cultural growth, such that the period of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries are often referred to as the early modern period, a necessary bridge between the medieval world to the modern world of the 19th and 20th centuries, as science and rationality began to expand and prevail. Yet, there were contradictions within this world too. Despite the growing drive towards reason and science, the century and a half after the inception of the Protestant Reformation in 1517 saw a series of unrelenting and savage civil wars and wars of religion across the continent between Roman Catholics and various Protestant denominations. The bloodiest of all began just a few short years before Hopkins was born. This was the 30 Years' War, which ravaged Germany between 1618 and 1648, and highlighted how a world in which rationality and reason were seemingly expanding was also one of religious dogma and immense violence at the same time. Another element of this paradoxical dichotomy between an age of reason and an age of superstition and crude religious beliefs, one which would be completely central to Matthew Hopkins' story, was the growing belief in the prevalence of witchcraft and malevolent forces in European society. Contrary to how it is perceived today, the belief in witches and the craze for hunting down witches was not actually a medieval phenomenon, but rather an early modern one. In fact, several popes had issued papal bulls or directives between the 10th and 13th centuries, decreeing that the belief in witches was not grounded in biblical theology, and that if communities suspected someone in their midst of being a witch, they should not jump to conclusions and instead refer the matter to their local priest or bishop. What changed matters was a series of crises in the 14th century, notably the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and then the arrival of the bubonic plague to Europe 3 decades later. The Black Death devastated Europe from 1346 onwards, killing roughly 1 in 3 Europeans by the end of the 1350s. As these miseries were visited on the continent, there was a major spike in the persecution of groups which were perceived to be on the fringes of society, notably Jewish communities, and also individuals who were social outsiders and were now accused in ever-growing numbers of witchcraft. This built slowly, and the European witch hunts could be perceived as running from the 1350s to the 1710s, encompassing the late medieval and early modern periods, but the peak of the witch hunts came between the 1580s and the 1650s. Hundreds of thousands of people would be accused across this period, and upwards of 70,000 or 80,000 would ultimately be killed, though the figures are disputed and may be considerably higher. Some countries experienced greater levels of persecution than others. The witch hunts were most intense in Germany and Switzerland, while within Britain there was a particularly intense witch craze in Scotland. England's witch craze was comparatively smaller, which makes the story of Matthew Hopkins, as we will soon see, especially unusual. One of the most popular core beliefs surrounding witches was that they had formed a pact between themselves and the devil, often at a gathering called a Sabbath. This term was not generally used at the time, and influential writings on witchcraft, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by the Dominican Heinrich Kramer, refer to assemblies instead. However, the idea of the gathering as an affront to a religious ceremony gained currency in popular culture in the later early modern period, hence the modern term. The Sabbath was thought of as a gathering of witches and potential witches at night in some lone and remote location. 3 core components formed the event: humans, witches who had traveled by some means, including flying broomsticks, the devil, and a procession of the undead. Paintings depicting the scene were produced since early modern times by artists such as Francisco Goya, Franz Franken the Younger, and Emile Bayard. It was at these gatherings that, in the view of popular society and witch hunters of the kind Matthew Hopkins briefly became, the first crimes were committed by the accused. Deviant sexuality is a constant theme advanced in texts such as the Malleus, which suggested that, if the woman in question did not physically travel to the location of the Sabbath, she could induce a hallucination by means of a flying ointment, a hallucinogen absorbed through the skin. Records suggest that this was applied through an act of erotic self-pleasure, with ointment applied first to a broom handle, which was then used as an object of self-stimulation. One record, detailing the trial of one Alice Keiteler, bears the passage, quote, "In rifling the closet of the lady, Alice Keiteler, they found a pipe of ointment, wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin, when and in what manner she listed." This is all suggestive of sexual deviancy in the minds of early modern people, and would sometimes be accompanied by an accusation that the woman in question had performed sexual acts with the devil himself, through which a person was supposedly recruited to be his agent on earth in the form of a witch. It was with this, the covenant formed between a witch and the devil, that Hopkins and his associates would concern themselves. The basis for an accusation of witchcraft was usually quite flimsy, though we do get cases where there does seem to have been a bizarre sequence of events which individuals at the time could only explain away through some supernatural act. Both men and women were tried for witchcraft during the early modern period, but it was overwhelmingly women who made up the ranks of those forced into the dock, often having endured hours of torture and interrogation. Over 80% of all those who are accused of witchcraft were women. There was a common trend amongst the accused, namely, that they were women who lived alone in a household without a male head. This meant that widows who had not had children or suffered miscarriages or the death of their children in infancy, or spinsters who had never married, were the most common targets of witchcraft accusations. In such close-knit communities, such women often did not live in the same manner as other people. Left to fend for themselves, the roles in the community often assigned to women in nuclear households could not be performed by widows and spinsters living alone in this way. Similarly, many of the men who found themselves accused of witchcraft were often unmarried or were individuals who were considered to be eccentric or social outsiders. When an accusation came forth against such people from a suspicious third party, many of the accused had little recourse to funds and friends to help in their defense. Those who appeared before the court were some of the most vulnerable in a community, and they often stood accused of crimes it was almost impossible to defend themselves against. While the scale of the witch hunts in England was relatively limited, there were unique aspects to it which would influence the manner in which Matthew Hopkins carried out his work in the mid-1640s. For instance, witchcraft had been formally criminalized through the Witchcraft Act in one of the parliaments of King Henry VIII in 1542. The act was repealed in 1547 following the accession of King Edward VI, but it was reintroduced in 1562, not long after Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne, and so witchcraft was punishable by death in England in the late 16th and 17th centuries. This meant that, unlike some other European countries, in England, witchcraft was considered a criminal, rather than exclusively religious, offense. Because of this, witches tried after this period were not burned alive, contrary to much popular belief, but hanged. Burning at the stake was a particularly nasty method of execution reserved in England for heretics. But, as witches were tried in civil rather than ecclesiastical courts, they were legally regarded as criminals rather than heretics. In the late 16th century, laws were reformed to allow witches to be tried and sentenced to death in local courts. That witchcraft was criminalized by the state is an indication of how serious a crime it was considered to be. Ecclesiastical courts had, over the early modern period, waned in their influence in the legal landscape of England, and their powers, as well as the cases they considered, grew less significant. The passing of a law against witchcraft, making it an offense which could be tried by the state rather than the church, suggests that this was a crime considered by the prevailing authorities in the 1540s to be serious, potent, and real. There were specific events which were occurring in England both shortly before Hopkins was born and during his lifetime, which led to an intensification of sentiment concerning witchcraft there in the middle of the 17th century. Firstly, in 1603, King James VI of Scotland had succeeded Queen Elizabeth I to become King James I of England and Ireland and 6th of Scotland. We have already seen that the witch craze was considerably more intense in Scotland than it was in England. The succession of a Scottish monarch to the English throne and the arrival of Scottish nobles and courtiers to London from 1603 onwards saw a transplantation of Scottish attitudes towards witchcraft to England. Indeed, the new king was himself a student of witchcraft. In 1597, 6 years before he succeeded Elizabeth in England, James had published a book in Scotland entitled Demonology. His interest in the subject was sparked when a woman who was accused of witchcraft in Scotland had stated at her trial that Satan had spoken to her and proclaimed that King James was his greatest mortal enemy on earth. Upon hearing that his name had been mentioned during the trial of this accused woman, James demanded that she be brought before him at the royal court so that she could repeat her testimony in person. In light of his firm Protestantism, James was doubtlessly pleased at being named Satan's greatest threat and arch-foe in the mortal realm. Indeed, the king was so eager to hunt witches thereafter that he produced Demonology. This work was to become influential in heightening concern and fear around witches in Scotland and later England, and was essential reading for people like Matthew Hopkins during the 17th century. In Demonology, James endorsed the practice of witch hunting and outlined the pact that was allegedly formed between the devil and those who practiced witchcraft. Witches, according to this idea, were men and women who had relinquished all Christianity in favor of forming an agreement with the devil so that, in return for supernatural powers, they would act as his servants on earth. Witches were insidious, living inside the community and acting as a sort of cancer that threatened the lives, well-being and livelihood of all earnest Christians. One final element of the political, social and religious background in which Hopkins lived and worked merits attention. By the late 1630s, there were growing tensions across the realms of King Charles I, the son and heir of King James, as to how Charles was governing England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. In Scotland, the broad political and religious community was opposed to James's efforts to enforce Episcopalianism. The idea that bishops should be appointed to govern the Scottish Kirk, or church, in the country, where Presbyterianism, a decentralized form of Protestantism, in which presbyters, or community elders, governed the church in each locality. This eventually spilled over into a war between the Crown and Charles's Scottish subjects in the later 1630s and early 1640s. When the Scots invaded northern England, the English Parliament attempted to exploit the situation to extract economic, political and religious concessions from Charles in return for their financial and military support against the Scots. This would eventually boil over into civil war in England in 1642. By then, Charles I's Irish subjects had also rebelled and had taken control of vast swathes of the country. These wars would rage on through the 1640s and into the early 1650s, eventually leading to the trial and execution of King Charles in 1649 and the creation of an English republic or commonwealth. This febrile atmosphere was ripe for the development of suspicion, fear, and concern. The English civil wars were, proportionately, one of the deadliest conflicts ever witnessed by the English. It is estimated that 4% of the total population died as a result of the conflict and its effects. Every family, every village, and every town was affected and blighted by the wars, which manifested not only in death on the battlefield, but by the division of counties, communities, and the devastation of the population by famine, the enforced billeting of soldiers on communities, and the collapse of vast swathes of local and national trade. Coupled with this was an environment in which malaria, the plague, and other deadly diseases were endemic, killing thousands every year in agonizing circumstances and without remedy. An explanation for the pain, suffering, and turmoil, much of it seemingly unexplained and misunderstood, was at the forefront of the minds of much of the English population, and many people turned to the supernatural in their angst, scapegoating outsiders in their communities as witches who were bringing this calamity down upon them. Into this atmosphere walked Matthew Hopkins in the mid-1640s. This lengthy preamble describing the nature of witchcraft and the witch hunts in early modern Europe and England in particular is vital to understanding Matthew Hopkins' story. Beyond the previously related brief details of his family background, the next substantial records that exist that mention Hopkins were not produced until 1644. All we know of the interim period is that he probably spent some of his late teens or early 20s living in the Dutch Republic, where he claimed to have received some legal training, as well as working as a mariner for a time. His legal training no doubt aided his later work in bringing witches to trial, while his time spent at sea amongst seamen, a community who were notoriously superstitious and favored astrological studies as a way of determining when was a lucky time to sail and so forth, doubtlessly informed his worldview in later years. The later records indicate that Hopkins had come to live in Manningtree in the county of Essex by 1644, on what is now the northernmost edge of the county, located next to an estuary. Hopkins had evidently been relatively successful in the intervening period since we last heard mention of him as a child, having purchased the Thorn Inn in nearby Mistley. It was at this juncture that, by his own account, he became concerned by a group of women living in the town. He began to fear that they were witches, those who had formed a pact with the devil in order to gain supernatural powers and had foregone their godly obligations as normal human beings. These initial investigations soon led to an alleged net of wider witches in Essex being discovered, one in which Elizabeth Clark was central. She was an obvious target for such accusations, as her mother had been found guilty of witchcraft many years earlier. Clark was accused by Hopkins of cursing the wife of the tailor of Manningtree, John Rivet, during the winter of 1643 and into 1644. His accusations soon led to a witch trial. As Hopkins was prohibited from extracting a confession under torture, he instead elected to engage in psychological torture, ensuring that Clark was sleep-deprived for days until she confessed to summoning familiars, a name at that time for animal forms of the devil, and cursing members of the local community. In the end, Clark was found guilty of witchcraft at the Chelmsford Assize trials and hanged, while dozens of others implicated in this alleged net of witches were imprisoned or suffered other punishments. It was the beginning of Hopkins' reign of terror. Much of the limited information we have concerning Hopkins and his views on both witchcraft and its place in English society during the crisis of the Civil Wars comes from a short treatise or pamphlet book which he produced and published in 1647. This was entitled The Discovery of Witches, or, to give it its full, rather cumbersome title, The Discovery of Witches, in answer to several queries lately delivered to the judges of assize for the county of Norfolk, and now published by Matthew Hopkins for the benefit of the whole kingdom. An idea of the kind of text Hopkins produced at his intention of publishing it was provided in the biblical quote which Hopkins placed on the cover. This came from the book of Exodus and stated, quote, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The text is a relatively brief one, small by comparison with its historical importance for the history of witchcraft in early modern England. It consists of 14 queries, with answers thereto on a wide range of matters relating to the identification, questioning, and punishment of witches. Hopkins also included some extra biographical information in it, as well as his methods and theories on witchcraft. Thus, cumulatively, it provides us with answers to a wide range of questions about Hopkins' activities and is the main primary source associated with understanding his actions, motives, techniques, and intention. Hopkins elaborated on his first encounter with witches in Essex in the fourth query of The Discovery of Witches. Here, he described a scene in Manningtree where every 6 weeks on a Friday night, 7 or 8 women from the town allegedly met a little way outside the collection of houses that constituted the village, in order to offer solemn sacrifices to the devil. One woman, involved in these Sabbath rituals, was overheard speaking to her imps, a term used to describe a sort of demon. The witch in question commanded her imps to meet with another member of her coven, who was subsequently apprehended. Women from the town searched the accused and found her to have several witches' marks, including an alleged third nipple, which, quote, "honest women have not." This use of birthmarks and other physical traits as proof of the guilt of a witch was common. With a witch thus identified, Hopkins then claims that the local magistrate ordered that the woman be deprived of sleep for 3 or 4 days in order to extract confessions and also to force their familiars, or demon animals, to appear, something which would provide clear evidence that she was, in fact, a witch. This description of events in Manningtree at the beginning of his work as a witch hunter provides a good insight into how Hopkins operated, and indeed, how witch hunts as a whole played out in early modern Europe. The methods used by Hopkins to interrogate the accused in Manningtree would be employed by him elsewhere in the years that followed. They remain one of the most controversial elements of his activities. Suspects could be subjected to what was called the swimming test. This was based on the belief that, since witches had renounced their baptism, holy water would reject them. The accused would thus be dunked into water, with the argument being that those who were guilty would survive. Those who drowned were therefore shown not to be witches after all. The only problem was that if they were innocent, they often drowned to death during questioning. The accused could also be cut with a blunt knife, the belief supposedly being that if they did not bleed, then they had the mark of the devil upon them. Hopkins replied to critics of the swimming test that the evil and cruelty of the devil was not suspended, even for his followers. The devil would promise his witches that the swimming test would not kill them, that they would be safe when ducked underwater and survive. This was yet another example of his treacheries. The devil did not step in to protect the witches, and they drowned. To Hopkins, even those who drowned could be witches who had fallen foul of the devil's deceit. Another way to extract specific confessions was, as we have seen in the Manningtree instance, through sleep deprivation. The accused would be kept awake by Hopkins for days on end, leading them to enter a mental state where the line between reality and hallucination was blurred. The women subjected to this practice would become so exhausted that they would believe that dreams were in fact true, and often formed the basis of many confessions. This latter point was particularly valuable for Hopkins and his associates. Although the popular perception today is of witches simply being lynched without due process by local communities, in reality, those who were accused of witchcraft had the right to a trial and due process. Legally, to find a person guilty of witchcraft, a confession had to be extracted from the accused person themselves. Thus, Hopkins was operating in the mid-1640s as witch-finder general within a legal framework. But, in reality, the confessions he acquired were generally obtained under torture, which is not a reliable method of extracting accurate confessions. The quote-unquote evidence collected from the first witch Hopkins questioned in Manningtree was used as the basis for the start of a wider witch hunt in Essex by Hopkins in 1644. Women, often under torture and duress, gave the name of other members of the community who they claimed had also sold their souls to the devil during Sabbath meetings. This created a domino effect, where a greater and greater number of women were indicted for the crime of witchcraft, something that was common in witch hunts all across early modern Europe. Eventually, as these investigations expanded outwards, dozens of people were arrested, questioned, and scheduled for trial. Such were the harsh methods employed by Hopkins that before the case even came to trial in the town of Chelmsford in the summer of 1645, 4 were already dead. 25 were sent to trial, and eventually over half of these were found guilty and hanged. In the discovery of witches, Hopkins concluded the segment discussing this initial hunt in Essex by suggesting that the devil was sent in the form of a bear to kill him for his actions in hunting down these witches in his local community, and that this experience inspired him to become a professional witch hunter. This provenance makes the methods of interrogation used by Matthew Hopkins and his band even more insidious. Women, pushed to the point of hallucination by sleep deprivation and psychological torture, were faced with accusations of witchcraft, not on the grounds of what they had done, but rather what they had often thought or imagined. A strange dream had years before, which involved anything remotely resembling the Sabbath or animals, could be evidence that a witch had hallucinated she was with the devil or summoning his familiars, actions considered just as grave as if she had attended the devil in person. Any birthmark or irregular patch of skin could suddenly become a telling witch's mark, and any out-of-the-ordinary recollection could be evidence that someone had abandoned God and formed a new covenant with Satan. The initial panic caused by Matthew Hopkins in his campaign of accusation in Manningtree spread into a wider set of accusations and trials. In neighboring Suffolk, in the months that followed, over 100 alleged witches were identified, with at least 40 executed. 20 further women were executed in Norfolk. From 1644, the year of Hopkins' first recorded accusation of witchcraft, it appears that he claimed to have an official appointment from Parliament as the Witchfinder General, tasked with hunting down those who had sold their souls to the devil. There is no official record of this appointment, and it is more than likely that Hopkins simply claimed this mantle without any appointment at all. During the chaos of the civil wars, where there were overlapping jurisdictions between the royalists and the parliamentarians across England and Wales, it was possible for a person to make such a claim without it having any legal basis. It is notable in this regard that there was no official post of Witchfinder General under normal circumstances in early modern England until Hopkins seemingly invented it in 1645. Hopkins was a religious man, but his motives for pursuing witches, as we will see, are still debated. At any rate, his appetite for the chase could not be confined to Essex, and he started to travel to different parishes around East Anglia, searching for people who could be accused of witchcraft. He soon became infamous for his activities. His rigorous and often brutal methods of interrogation and trial were notable even in the 17th century. Hopkins formed an association with another witch-hunting enthusiast, John Sterne, a fellow resident of Manningtree, whom Hopkins appointed as his assistant during the hunts there, in 1644 and 1645, and a group of women, known as searchers, who examined the accused for witch marks. Hopkins and his band would soon travel from town to town, offering his services as a supposedly professional investigator who could demonstrate whether an accused person was, in fact, a witch. Though he later claimed that he was generally called to come to a community to investigate suspicious events there, in reality, Hopkins and his followers often came uninvited and then stoked concern about social outcasts and eccentrics in their midst. We gain an insight into how Hopkins' mind worked, and indeed how most people treated charges of witchcraft in early modern times, from a response he gave to a question on his methods. This related to the use of skin blemishes and moles to identify people as being marked through their association with the devil. Many people asked the obvious question: why were these signs of some satanic collaboration in witches, when so many other people who were not accused of witchcraft also had skin marks of one kind or another? Hopkins responded that, in essence, he just knew by seeing one which were signs of witchcraft and which weren't. Hopkins made sure to precede this answer with a defense of his claim to great skill, experience and expertise in the field, and therefore evidently believed he had done a good job in convincing the reader of the discovery of witches that in matters of witch hunting, he was a man who could be taken at his word. Despite this brief diversion to ask the reader just to trust him, he then answers in a different prose that one could identify a witch's mark in 3 ways. The mark would be in a strange place on the body, it would be numb to pain, and it would sometimes be surrounded by dry or irritated skin, a result of where imps had tried to remove the mark before it could be uncovered by Hopkins and his associates. From their initial work in Manningtree in Essex, Hopkins and his band traveled further afield, offering their investigative services to people living in nearby towns and villages. The extent to which people actively sought out Matthew Hopkins to help them with their concerns is unclear. It seems to be the case that, in many instances, Hopkins and his group muscled into ongoing dramas in local communities and then introduced the idea that the source of a problem could be witchcraft. News of this Witchfinder General spread through the land, and soon Hopkins, accompanied by his ever-present associate John Stearne, visited towns and villages in Suffolk, Norfolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, and Huntingdonshire between 1645 and 1647, with a couple of cases being investigated in places as far away as Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. During the Civil War, these regions came under the control of parliamentarian forces and were organized into an administrative district known as the Eastern Association, which represented those areas which largely bankrolled the parliamentary army. Indeed, the importance of the Eastern Association as a source of tax revenue was shown when the authorities in Ipswich introduced a special local tax rate on witch hunting. Such was the scale of the income that Hopkins was able to garner. It appears that Hopkins and Stearne charged the towns they entered a flat rate for their services, which they claimed was to maintain their company along with 3 horses. The total charge mentioned by Hopkins per town was 20 shillings or £1 sterling, which is equivalent to thousands of pounds today. However, town records suggest that Hopkins was not entirely accurate in his claim to only charge towns £1 for his services. Records from the Suffolk town of Stowmarket, for instance, show that the town was charged £23, though what the extraordinary circumstances for such a charge might have been are unclear. As Hopkins, Stern, and their other sometime employees moved from region to region, they adduced numerous different reasons for why their victims were engaged in witchcraft. In the 13th query of the Discovery of Witches, Hopkins outlines the sort of relationship which he believed witches had with the devil and the sort of powers that they gained from him once they had submitted themselves to his covenant. There is an attempt at a religious argument, with Hopkins suggesting that God suffered the devil to perform such evil in the world, allowing him to enter as an impostor through the agency of human beings, which in early modern times were witches. The deal made between the devil and his followers was, according to Hopkins, formal, following the same pattern and nature each and every time it was constituted. The devil would, at a Sabbath, held in some distant and remote place, maybe a moor or a heath, address the hopefuls who had gathered there and ask, quote, "What will you have me do for you, my dear and nearest children, covenanted and compacted with me in my hellish league, and sealed with your blood, my delicate firebrand darlings?" To this, the witches would answer that they wanted protection and security in return from Satan, if they were to submit to him. First, the witch would be granted protection from discovery, to which the devil agreed to murder anyone who posed a threat or could raise the alarm. He would also ensure that no one stood in the way of the ambitions of the witch in question, allowing them a free path to whatever end they desired, without interference from others. The key part of the contract was that Satan would act through the witch to effect these killings, whether through disease or murder, as a physical act. The devil would not work remotely, but would provide the witch with the knowledge and the power they needed to eliminate these threats, whereby she could be the instrument of murder herself. Any misfortune, famine, illness, the death of infants or accidents, could all be taken as Satan acting through one who had formed a covenant with him to benefit their own ends. The agreement reached, the witch would then submit to Satan and all of his laws, mischief, and evil intention. This belief and claim that the person who had become a witch had done so by entering into a formal, almost legal contract with the devil in the full knowledge of his ambitions, intentions, and immorality, in return for power and favor with him, was central to the case which was to be made against them in court. Hopkins also argued in his writings that the supernatural influence in any malign event could be detected instantly by a judge or magistrate, pointing to the greater crime being committed, that the person had formed an agreement with Satan to undertake the earthly crime of which they had also been indicted. Hopkins' methods were controversial even in his own time. As he began to range around England in 1646, the clergyman John Gall preached against Hopkins from his pulpit in Great Staughton, Cambridgeshire. Gall also wrote a pamphlet entitled "Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft," which directly addressed the methods used by Hopkins and Stern. He argued that the swimming test used by Hopkins was ridiculous, and that, more broadly, A greater evidential basis was needed before a charge of witchcraft could be substantiated and a serious punishment administered. The sort of evidence collected by Hopkins, under duress, and often after a bout of torture, was not considered by Gall to constitute sufficient evidence of witchcraft. This was not to say that Gall denied the existence or the malign influence of witchcraft. However, he decried the methods used by Hopkins and the sort of hype he generated to warrant his high fees. Indeed, whilst higher parliamentary authorities seemed relatively unconcerned about the Witchfinder General, assize judges at the Aya and Termina sessions did question both Hopkins and Stern about the methods they employed to gain a confession. Over the course of their questioning, it was even suggested by a judge that Hopkins and Stern might themselves be using witchcraft to try and extract these confessions. Another suggested, perhaps more calmly, that Hopkins was using, quote, unlawful courses of torture to extract this information. However, once the session resumed, both Hopkins and Stern had returned to their bases in Essex, meaning that these deliberations did not amount to anything beyond speculation. There was good reason to be suspicious of his actions. Hopkins' own writings demonstrate clearly how these tactics of sleep deprivation provided worthless evidence. His wording makes this plain. Of one such interrogation he wrote that, quote, on the fourth night without sleep, she, the woman apprehended in Manningtree, called in her imps by their several names, and told them what shapes a quarter of an hour before they came in, there being 10 of us in the room. He goes on to describe how, exhausted and deprived of sleep for 4 days straight, the accused woman eventually described 5 familiars who were her accomplices. A white kickling, probably a kitten, called Holt, a fat spaniel dog called Jamara, a greyhound called Vinegar Tom, a black rabbit called Sack and Sugar, and a polecat called News. Having identified these 5 familiars, the witch proceeded to name other witches and her various imps. Their names included Peckin the Crown, Grizzle, and Greedygut. Hopkins eagerly claimed in the next sentence of his pamphlet that, quote, no mortal could invent these names. To the reader today, these are quite plainly the confused and terrified thoughts of an exhausted, pursued, elderly woman being prompted to offer her evidence to incriminate herself after days of sleep deprivation. The scene is illustrated in the Discovery of Witches in a printed image, showing 2 women surrounded by their familiars thus named, with Hopkins watching on from the top of the scene. Hopkins was also sensible of the controversy which surrounded his use of the swimming test and sleep deprivation, and argued that keeping a witch awake brought her closer to her imps and familiars, without regard to the effects of sleep deprivation itself, including hallucination. Indeed, the next few entries in Hopkins' pamphlet try and deal with questions over evidence and his use of torture. For instance, in the 10th query, it was stated that, quote, there hath been an abominable, inhumane, and unmerciful trial of these poor creatures, by tying them and heaving them into the water. A trial not allowable by law or conscience, and I would fain know the reasons for that. This appears to present a well-reasoned self-criticism by Hopkins, that he then responded that, whilst it was true that many women had died as a result of the swimming test, it was important to understand how the devil thought and operated with witches. He made it so that witches would only confess under the kind of duress which inadvertently caused the deaths of some innocent people, but Hopkins argued that this was a necessary price in order to identify the servants of the devil. Another controversial feature of Hopkins' work was his legal right to act in the way that he did. He famously claimed that he had a mandate from Parliament to undertake his investigations as Witchfinder General, which would then provide evidence for use in what were called commissions of Oyer and Terminer, inquiries which were set up to deal with a specific set of crimes, which were a particular problem in a specific area. Grand juries presided over Oyer and Terminer sessions in the localities, alongside a judge of the assizes or circuit courts. Coastal areas of England often hosted Oyer and Terminer commissions designed to place pirates and smugglers on trial. In East Anglia, Hopkins' activities led to a string of cases in which claims of witchcraft were made against members of the community for misfortune and upset. Parliamentary authorities were aware of what Hopkins and Stern were doing and mentioned them as busy men in reports produced ahead of the commissioning of an Oyer and Terminer session at Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. This seems to suggest the parliamentary authorities were, on the whole, bemused but indifferent about what Hopkins was up to. There were simply bigger fish for them to fry in relation to the wider civil war and the administration of the Eastern Association. Hopkins and Stern provided evidence for use in the court, and they were, in this sense, a helpful aid to the judicial system, which parliamentary authorities were in the process of reconfiguring since they had come under new control in these regions. The often secretive activities of Hopkins, Stern, and his female aides means that few records exist which demonstrate Hopkins' specific role in the many trials in which he was involved in East Anglia and other parts of England between 1645 and 1647. Court records, and particularly those made at Oyer and Terminer sessions, are incredibly brief. Many simply recall the sentence that was ultimately passed, without reference to the specific evidence that was provided, while local records of this kind were kept in a particularly haphazard fashion during the civil wars of the 1640s, with others destroyed as a result of the unrest. All of this makes Hopkins a strange character for the historian to examine. There are no formal records which directly report his birth, and no records which show what he did prior to his emergence on the historical record in 1644, or how he lived. The only records we have of Hopkins relate to the final few years of his life, during which time he operated at the very center of the largest and most intense witch hunt England had ever seen. Between 1645 and 1647, over 250 accusations of witchcraft were made in the region of East Anglia, leading to the death of possibly well over 100 people. It has been estimated from court records that the evidence collected by Hopkins, through his methods of torture and examination, was used in the trial of over 300 people, overwhelmingly women. This raises questions as to whether or not he had ulterior motives. Why Hopkins decided to embark on his career as a witch hunter remains unclear. The only record directly produced by Hopkins was the Discovery of Witches, which in itself is a short text and not an autobiographical one. Clearly, Hopkins was a religious man, and one living in a region of England which was a hotbed of Puritanism, the purest Protestant faith espoused by the parliamentarians in the civil wars. These religious quarrels of the 1640s would have spurred people in the communities Hopkins was visiting to be especially guarded about witchcraft at the time, although it does not, by itself, provide an adequate motive to spark the most intense witch hunt ever seen in England. More than likely, Hopkins was simply a businessman who identified a lucrative and largely unexploited niche in the market. Conditions for a witch finder were perfect. Fear, suspicion, and tension were at an all-time high during the unrest of the 1640s. Religious sensibilities had been shaken and threatened, and the sort of women pursued by Hopkins and his band had little recourse to defend themselves, occupying a space in society which meant they would receive little love or support from their neighbors. Donning an official-looking outfit, claiming to have a government mandate as witchfinder general, and playing on the innate fears which lay in the hearts and minds of many in East Anglia, Hopkins posed as a competent, trustworthy figure, with the promise to ferret out any collaborators with the devil. During a time of such upheaval, communities were glad to pay for what he was selling. Hopkins closed his 1647 pamphlet by tackling accusations that he was some sort of con man who charged extortionate prices from his customers as a way of sustaining the cost of traveling for him and his associates. In response to an accusation that, quote, "all that the witchfinder doth is to fleece the country of their money, and therefore rides and goes to towns to have employment, and promiseth them fair promises, and it may be doth nothing for it, and possesseth many men, that they have so many wizards and so many witches in their town, and so heartens them on to entertain him." Hopkins responded that he had never been to a town where he had either not been directly invited to come and attended to a specific concern or issue, or where the townspeople were not glad of the sight of him. He also claimed that he provided good value for money in the provision of his services, making the claim that he would ride for days on end, apprehend several witches, and only ever charged 20 shillings a town, with this also covering the expenses of Sterne and their other staff. This, as we know from the example of Stowmarket, where he charged a rate of £23, was not always the case, and Hopkins also simply showed up to towns and did his level best to exacerbate tensions there to benefit himself. Matthew Hopkins died on the 12th of August 1647, back in Manningtree. His death was likely caused by tuberculosis. In line with common practice at the time, he was buried only a few hours after his death in the churchyard of St. Mary in Mistley. John Stearne continued their work for another year, though he proved less successful than Hopkins had, and with some semblance of order beginning to return to England following the end of the Second English Civil War. In August 1648, the window for a rogue witchfinder general to operate around the country was closing. He subsequently published his own text in 1648 to complement Hopkins' Discovery of Witches, the title of which, A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft, was clearly designed to add to the arguments put forward by his colleague before his death. Collectively, their writings, along with earlier texts, such as King James's Demonology, went on to influence how English men and women perceived witches, witchcraft, and the interrogation of witches down to the end of the 17th century and beyond. The irony of the story of Matthew Hopkins and his work as Witchfinder General was that, by the late 1640s, the witch hunts across Europe were beginning to decline in intensity. After a peak period between 1580 and 1640, the number of people being accused and convicted of witchcraft declined markedly. In the 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s, as the scientific revolution saw reason triumph over superstition, and as the European wars of religion, which had caused such intense religious feeling since the early 16th century, also came to an end. By the time the famous Salem witch trials occurred in Massachusetts in the 13 colonies in North America in the early 1690s, the witch hunts were virtually over in Europe itself. The 1700s and 1710s saw the last official witch trials in many countries, and several countries moved in the years that followed to ban people from prosecuting people in their communities on witchcraft charges altogether. The last witch trials were held in England, in Leicester in 1717, and Parliament criminalized witchcraft trials in the country in 1736. Nevertheless, throughout the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th, Matthew Hopkins' Discovery of Witches continued to influence how witchcraft was perceived in the country. By the time the last execution on charges of witchcraft occurred in England in 1716, over 500 people, of which more than 90% were women, had occurred in England as part of the witch hunts, though this paled in comparison to a country like the Swiss Confederacy, where approximately 10,000 were killed. Of those killed in England, most died in the politically tense period of the 1640s, and Matthew Hopkins is believed to have been involved in trials that involved upwards of 200 deaths, making him the most significant figure in the English witch craze of the early modern period. Matthew Hopkins is thought of by some as an obsessive, a figure who became convinced that he had a mission to hunt down and destroy witches in England, who, in his mind and in the minds of the communities he served, posed a genuine and real threat to the souls of Christians across England and the safety of all people. Others take a different view, that Hopkins was fundamentally an unprincipled, money-driven Christian who extracted confessions from women he did not believe to be guilty of witchcraft through the use of techniques he knew would lead them to hallucinate, often in so doing, make statements which could be used in evidence against them before the court. It is important, when considering how we think about Matthew Hopkins today, that we remember that we know next to nothing about him. With the scant records we have of him relating only to the final few years of his life, his discovery of witches is one of the few major sources concerning Hopkins. It reveals a man who felt he was under scrutiny from the public and from the legal authorities in the Eastern Association on both his methods and the validity of his accusations, against which he pits often contradictory and awkward counter-arguments. We also know from this record that he was dishonest about the fees he charged and the sort of methods that he used, as well as who ordered such techniques to be deployed. Indeed, his claim that it was the courts which ordered him to undertake torture against the accused does not tally with the fact that in 1647, it was the same courts which were starting an investigation into Hopkins and Stearn for their use of illegal methods of torture. It is highly likely that Hopkins lied about being a formal witch-finder general employed by the government, given that state records refer to him simply as a busy man, rather than an official in their employ. There are no records of any official appointment or even education of Matthew Hopkins, and it instead appears that he was simply exploiting the chaotic political and social environment of the Civil War years in England to present himself as something he wasn't. This had consequences, and Hopkins' duplicity and actions led to the suffering of many people. Between 1644 and 1647, hundreds of people suffered at his hands, and many died as a result of the false indictments against them that Hopkins made possible. This was an accusation which overwhelmingly affected the poorest, most isolated and most vulnerable in a community, and regardless of whether or not Matthew Hopkins embarked on his campaign, believing that it was a divine mission or simply a way to make easy money, the pain and suffering inflicted on his victims were very considerable. What do you think of Matthew Hopkins? Was his zeal driven by genuine belief or a desire to get rich quick? What do you think really lay behind the witch craze in early modern Europe? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Theodore Robert Bundy was born on the 24th of November 1946 at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, as Theodore Robert Cowell. His mother was Louise Cowell, a department store clerk and the eldest of Philadelphia businessman Samuel Cowell's 3 daughters. According to her, Ted was the product of his mother's brief fling with the mysterious World War II veteran Jack Worthington, who she met after graduating from high school in 1946. They split up when Louise was 7 months pregnant, after which Louise moved from Philadelphia to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, an organization that assisted pregnant single mothers at a time when having children outside of wedlock was looked down upon. After Ted was born, Louise and her newborn moved from Philadelphia to Tacoma in Washington state to move closer to her uncle Jack Cowell. Encouraged by her friends to attend young adult nights at the local First Methodist Church, one night Louise was swept off her feet by a native and soft-spoken North Carolinian called John Culpeper Bundy, also known as Johnny, who had just left the Navy. In May 1951, the couple married. The union would lead over time to the arrival of Ted's 4 half-siblings, Linda, Glenn, Sandra, and Richard, who were born respectively in 1952, 1954, 1956, and 1961. Although quiet and reserved, Ted's stepfather, who he believed to be his biological father for many years, could be violent if provoked. The intricacies of Ted's multifaceted personality have been extensively debated by very experienced psychologists, without any firm conclusions being agreed upon. The defense psychiatrist, Dr. Dorothy Opnow Lewis, alluding to the way in which Bundy could suddenly switch from one version of himself to another in an instant, as many of his victims would experience in their last moments, would suggest he suffered from an acute case of bipolar disorder. Others have noticed that he displayed all the hallmarks of antisocial personality disorder, notably a complete lack of remorse, a penchant for violence, disregard for truth and social norms, and a materialistic urge to steal. The one thing there is a general consensus on is that Bundy was a sociopath or psychopath. In addition, Bundy displayed elements of a litany of disturbing deviances, such as biastophilia, in which arousal is heightened by the assault of a person who doesn't consent, as well as voyeurism and sadism. In appearance, Ted Bundy was a good-looking and charming man who had brown curly hair, which he later shortened, piercing blue eyes, and an athletic figure. Like a Venus flytrap, he used his charisma to lure in his prey and to avoid detection by the police. With no distinguishing features that made it easy for the authorities to identify him, he also had the ability to change his appearance substantially, with small alterations such as the addition of a mustache, the growing out of his beard, or the adoption of a new haircut. The earliest manifestation of Bundy's violent tendencies may have occurred when he was just 3 years old, when his Aunt Julia woke up to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives and her young, smiling nephew. Aside from this, however, from the outside he appeared to be a normal child, who believed in Santa Claus and hated vegetables. Yet, as he would later reveal in unusually candid interviews, which he gave not long before his execution, it was from this early age that he first felt a creeping, a vague uneasiness that would later spiral into an uncontrollable impulse to murder. During his first 3 years living with his grandparents and mother in Philadelphia, due to the stigma surrounding single mothers at the time, Bundy was led to believe that his grandparents were his real parents, and that his mother was his elder sister. This was further complicated when he was told that his elder sister was actually his mother, and that his stepfather Johnny Bundy was his real father, with many stating that this initial identity crisis may have helped create his fractured personality. It probably did contribute to some degree to his nebulous sense of not belonging. In 1954, following the birth of his half-brother Glenn, the Bundy family moved into a larger home in a new neighborhood to accommodate their growing brood. And it was here that Ted met his 2 best friends from childhood, Terry Storwick and Warren Dodge, who quickly learned that Ted had a very short fuse. Storwick later recalled how, While playing a war game in which fibrous ferns were thrown like missiles, he accidentally caught Ted below the eye, prompting Bundy to attack him in a rage. As Bundy grew older, he tried his hand at team sports such as basketball and baseball, but he was never able to get on the team, a fact that greatly embarrassed the extremely self-conscious adolescent. As a result, he decided to take up solo sports, such as skiing, which he practiced using expensive ski equipment he had stolen, a fact that would have greatly shocked his family friends, who only knew him as a regular churchgoer with ambitions to pursue a career in law enforcement. This tendency towards kleptomania would become stronger over time, and was a central part of Bundy's unusual psychology, with him later describing his more violent crimes in terms which indicated that he wished to almost steal the life essence from his victims. Ted's rebellious streak would take an ominous turn when, according to the most likely version of events, his true parentage was revealed by his antagonistic cousin John, who procured his birth certificate to prove to him that Johnny was not his real father. Resentful that his mother had lied to him about his origins, Ted became even more dismissive of his stepfather, and henceforth refused to call him Dad, starting to only refer to him as John. The resulting friction caused Johnny, who was an otherwise mild-mannered man, to lash out more at his stepson when he was provoked. Going from middle school to Woodrow Wilson High School, Bundy, whose outward charm hid a chronic lack of self-confidence, described it as the moment he decided to socially withdraw from society because he suddenly found it impossible to integrate or relate to his classmates. From then on, he would only ever feel truly himself when he was in the classroom. Taking comfort from its formal setting, he spoke up regularly in class, cultivating an image of the serious-minded intellectual to hide his loneliness and his inability to understand other people, especially the wants, needs, and desires of girls, which mystified him. Living from home in his freshman year at the University of Puget Sound, Ted began developing the outward appearance of a normal, functioning human being, while on the inside, the malevolent elements of his personality were still stirring. In the first year at Puget Sound, he kept to himself, but his narcissistic tendencies meant that he didn't want to be entirely invisible, and, looking for something a tad more glamorous to shroud his true nature, he applied for a transfer to the University of Washington's first-class Asian Studies program in Seattle to study the Chinese language. In Seattle in 1966 and 1967, he began to open up a little more to other people, and he soon started receiving attention from a fellow student, Diane Edwards, who had been identified under various aliases in studies of Bundy's life. Despite his attraction to her and their tendency to spend their nights together, Ted made no sexual advances, as if introducing physicality into the relationship would somehow corrupt it. In an effort to continue spending time with her, Ted enrolled in an intensive Chinese language course at Stanford University. However, he soon failed most of his classes, and soon his unimpressed girlfriend, who had also become increasingly annoyed at his childhood habit of sneaking up on her, broke up with him. After their breakup, he returned home irritable and depressed, and by 1968, feeling worthless, he was back in Seattle, where he rented a small apartment, worked as a busboy in a hotel dining room, and as a night stalker in a Safeway store, and started committing acts of petty thievery. Then, one day, Ted bumped into an old acquaintance from high school, who suggested that he volunteer to work for Art Fletcher, a local city councilman who was the Republican Party's nominee for the upcoming elections for lieutenant governor. A staunch Republican, Ted jumped at this opportunity and he approached the unpaid position with enthusiasm. eventually being named Art Fletcher's personal driver and a bodyguard of sorts. It was during this run also that Ted, who most studies agree had not had relations of any kind up to this, had his first such experience. This occurred at a campaign party. Having got very drunk and been whisked away to a colleague's house to rest, he describes how in a semi-conscious state he had seen an unknown woman enter into his bed. She undressed him and proceeded to engage in intercourse with him. Not long afterwards, when his job on the Fletcher campaign came to an end, Bundy found employment as a salesman in a Seattle department store. This didn't last long, though perhaps the experience, along with his time working around political types who didn't mean what they said, cultivated his ability to talk his way out of situations and charm people into doing what he wanted. Skills that would become integral to his brutal activities in the 1970s. Soon he headed out to Philadelphia to continue his studies at Temple University for one semester in 1969. That autumn, though, he was back in Washington, and at a local bar, Bundy met Elizabeth Kendall, a 24-year-old medical secretary from Utah and single mother of a daughter named Tina. Falsely introducing himself as a law student who was writing a book on the Vietnam War, Elizabeth fell for him immediately, and they began a relationship. Ted and Elizabeth's whirlwind romance blossomed so quickly that after 3 months, they were both seriously considering getting married. Yet Ted's lies would eventually catch up to him. He soon had to reveal that in actual fact he was a university dropout, working as a legal messenger. Elizabeth forgave him this and many of his other toxic traits, which included seeing other women to make her jealous. Underneath the surface, though, Ted's sickness was getting worse, and it was around this time that he began watching violent pornography and prowling around after dark, peeping into women's windows and stealing things, often for seemingly little reason. Driven by a need to understand his own confusing psychological makeup, Bundy began a new major in psychology at the University of Washington, where for once he did well academically, graduating in the spring of 1972. Thereafter, he stated his desire to study the law, but he soon realized he was not well suited for a legal career and was rejected by numerous law schools. Then, with the assistance of a grant, he began working with psychiatric outpatients at the Harborview Hospital in Seattle. These were years of flux for Bundy, and he also returned to politics, volunteering as a helper in the upcoming local election campaign on behalf of Governor Dan Evans of the Republican Party. To all those who knew him on the campaign trail in 1972, Bundy was an intelligent and handsome man with a bright future. Yet to his girlfriend Elizabeth, much of his behavior was increasingly unsettling. She would later recollect that he threatened to physically harm her if she told anyone about his peculiar stealing habits. On another occasion, he strangely came back home with the surgical glove bulging from his pocket and retrieved a crowbar from behind a radiator. Another night, she awoke to find him examining her body with a flashlight under the covers. In assessing all of this, it should be noted that while the first murder which Bundy can be absolutely connected to would not occur until 1974, investigators in the late 1970s and 1980s became convinced that he had committed several murders as far back as the 1960s, and when he was dating Elizabeth in Seattle in the early 1970s. After the 1972 election, and armed with a profusion of supporting documents, which included a letter of recommendation from Governor Evans, Bundy managed to secure a place at the University of Utah Law College for a course that started in the autumn of 1973. It was in the months leading up to the program, while he worked briefly for the Seattle Crime Commissioner's newsletter, writing articles on sexual assault prevention among other subjects, that he would first make a splash in the newspapers, not as a vicious serial killer, but as an everyday hero. Whilst out shopping with Elizabeth, Ted ran after and apprehended a purse stealer, pinning him down until the police arrived, resulting in an article in the local Seattle Times that praised his bravery. It was events like this, and his recommendations from leading political figures in Washington state, that would later make police disinclined to pursue Bundy as a potential perpetrator of some of his crimes in the mid-1970s. Around this time, based on advice from Marlin Vortman, another veteran of the 1972 Evans campaign, who recommended that Ted should pursue law school at the nearby University of Puget Sound, rather than the out-of-state University of Utah, Bundy decided to do so. His reasoning being that if he wanted to get involved in state politics at a later stage, it would be useful to get to know the local magistrates. Taking Marlin's advice, he enrolled in night law school at the University of Puget Sound, to the bewilderment of Elizabeth, who was beginning to realize that she had little or no influence on his actions. Starting at the University of Puget Sound in a nondescript office building in downtown Tacoma, Ted soon realized that he had signed up to a truly second-rate school, and by December 1973, he had started secretly reapplying to the University of Utah. While Bundy might have outwardly appeared to be a relatively normal character at this time, one who had a committed girlfriend, had volunteered in numerous political campaigns, and aspired to become a lawyer, in reality, his nefarious behavior and psychology was about to start manifesting itself in a more appalling manner. Early in the morning of the 4th of January 1974, Bundy committed the first major crime that we have concrete information concerning. At approximately 2 a.m., a 21-year-old dance student by the name of Karen Sparks, who went by the alias Terry Caldwell, turned off her TV and retired to her basement room in the house she shared with 3 other men on 4325 8th Avenue in the University District of Seattle. The next day, when she still hadn't emerged by 7:30 p.m., her housemates entered her room and discovered to their horror that she had been savagely beaten around her head and was close to death. She was immediately sent to hospital. Remaining in a coma for 10 days, she would survive, though with permanent brain damage. Bundy was responsible for the attack. It is highly unlikely, however, that this was the first such crime Bundy had committed, and one of the most recent biographies of Bundy claims he had killed as early as 1961, when he was little more than a teenager. By the time he attacked Terry Caldwell, he was already a journeyman murderer. Over the next decade, Bundy would gradually refine his methods to become one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. He was aided immensely in the crime spree that followed by the fact that CCTV was not widely used in the 1970s, and many other types of digital evidence which could be used to catch a serial killer today, were also not available in the 1970s. DNA evidence, one of the best methods of catching murderers today, would not enter widespread use in law enforcement until the 1990s. Impediments such as these, when combined with Bundy's tendency to argue and charm his way out of tight situations, would facilitate his murders over the next several years. A month after Terry Caldwell narrowly escaped death, Bundy struck again, this time against one Linda Ann Healy. On the 1st of February 1974, having returned to her apartment which was minutes away from Caldwell's, Healy went to bed, only to be snatched from it quietly in the early morning hours and never seen again. Her death is generally regarded as the first of Bundy's confirmed murders. The next was Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student studying at the Evergreen State College in nearby Olympia, who on the 12th of March 1974 was abducted whilst on her way to a jazz concert. Bundy later disclosed that he incinerated her skull in his girlfriend Elizabeth's fireplace while she was out. After this, on the 17th of April 1974, Bundy lured Susan Elaine Rancourt to his car by pretending to be a disabled man who needed her help to carry some heavy books, a method he would use regularly thereafter to kidnap many young women. Soon after he killed Rancourt, Bundy informed Elizabeth of his surprise decision to transfer to Utah in September, making it seem to her as if it was a recent choice, despite him having already organized it 4 months earlier. In the meantime, Ted landed a summer job at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, or DES, where his main priority was to work on the institution's biannual budget, a perfect cover for his secret double life. Over the next several months, Bundy continued to commit several murders. By now, clear patterns were emerging. Bundy would often kidnap his victims, who were all young women in their late teens and the first half of their 20s, before taking them to more secluded places, where he would typically force himself on them before committing the murder, before disposing of the rest of the body. In later years, it would also be revealed that Bundy began returning to the remains of some of his victims. It was also around this time that he expanded the geographical area in which he was operating. For instance, when he kidnapped 21-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks, this occurred in Oregon, not in Washington State. Not long after, on the 1st of June 1974, he kidnapped and murdered 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball after she left a popular student dive bar, the Flame Tavern, in Burien, Seattle. In a sign of his growing mania, it was just 9 days later, on the 10th of June 1974, that Bundy struck again. This time the target was Georgianne Hawkins, an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Washington, who that night had taken a break from studying for her exams to attend a party. Walking home in the dark, Georgianne came across Bundy, masquerading as a disabled man. He hit her over the head with a crowbar, handcuffed her, and then drove her to a rural location. She was never seen again. The changes in Bundy's behavior had not gone unnoticed amongst those who knew him in his life as a citizen. For instance, a work colleague of Ted's from this time noted that between June and August 1974, he seemed to lose a lot of weight, upwards of 15 pounds. A notable change in him was also detected by his girlfriend Elizabeth, who noticed that his sexual appetite had markedly increased from spring 1974 onwards, as had the frequency of his bizarre and erratic behavior. This came to a head on the 6th of July 1974. On that day, while the couple were river rafting, Bundy suddenly pushed Elizabeth into the water, and when she came up for air to scold him, he icily made no response, later explaining that it was just a joke. She didn't leave him at this juncture, but she became increasingly suspicious of his behavior in general, in ways which would have implication for Bundy in the long run. By late 1974, a police investigation was underway. As the killings and disappearances of young women in Washington state had mounted throughout the year, police were starting to suspect that there was a more malevolent explanation and pattern to these. However, the full horror of what they were dealing with only became apparent in mid-July. According to eyewitnesses, on the 14th of July, Janice Ann Ott, a 23-year-old probation officer, was lounging around in a black two-piece bikini in the park near Lake Sammamish when she was approached by a man in an arm sling, asking her if she could help put his sailboat on his car. Bundy then led her to a pre-selected area and had his way with her before killing her. Yet he was still not satiated, and by now Bundy was developing a sense of invincibility as he committed crime without any repercussions. Thus, directly thereafter, he made his way back to Lake Sammamish. There, he met 18-year-old Denise Nusland. Just over an hour after Denise disappeared, Ted was at Elizabeth's door and complaining that he was starving. They both went to a local joint where he devoured 2 enormous hamburgers, much to her surprise. Once it was established that both young women who had been at Lake Sammamish on the 14th of July 1974 had disappeared, detectives started receiving their first descriptions of the anonymous killer, who had felt audacious enough to commit his crimes in open daylight and whose movements during the day had been observed by hundreds of eyewitnesses in the first major mistake of his homicidal career. As a result, from personal accounts and observances, it was learned that the potential killer referred to himself as Ted, and that he drove a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. The published sketches were alarming for Elizabeth, who couldn't help but notice Ted's familiar jawline, and equally couldn't ignore the fact that the depicted monster was known to drive the same car as her boyfriend. On the other hand, there were also many discrepancies that made her downplay her suspicions. Yet these would only re-emerge in the months before his departure, when she discovered a hatchet in his car and noticed that he had shaved his hair extremely short. Nevertheless, she still wasn't fully convinced, and so when Ted left for Utah in September, days before the decaying remains of Janice Ott and Denise Nussland were discovered, she embraced and kissed him before he left. Traveling down to Salt Lake City and by himself at last, the Grim Reaper wasted no time satisfying his carnal cravings. And once he got to his destination, Ted Bundy was noticeably absent from his classes for 6 weeks, while he familiarized himself with the local area. A new killing frenzy started on the 2nd of October 1974, when 16-year-old cheerleader Nancy Wilcox was picked up by Bundy in the small city of Holiday, Utah, and never seen again. Bundy would later confess to her killing, although peculiarly, much of the testimony that he provided concerning her was later found to be false, and her body was never recovered. Just over 2 weeks later, on the evening of the 18th of October, 17-year-old Melissa Smith, who was the daughter of the Midvale Chief of Police, Lewis Smith, left the Pepperoni Pizza Palace only to be abducted. Rather shockingly, when her body was discovered 9 days later, it was determined that she had only been dead for approximately 3 days, opening up the horrifying possibility that she had gone through a 5 or 6 day ordeal at Bundy's hands. Even more disturbingly, it was observed that Smith's makeup had been reapplied, her nails had been painted, and that her body had been cleaned, as if she was some kind of doll. As the news of these disappearances proliferated around the state, parents Jim and Shirley Aim of Salem, Utah, took the opportunity to remind their carefree 17-year-old daughter Laura of the dangers of hitchhiking, but she shrugged off their warnings. It would prove to be a fatal miscalculation, for on Halloween night 1974, after leaving a party at about midnight, she would come face to face with Bundy when she stuck her thumb out on Highway 89, looking for a ride into the city of Lehi. By now, Bundy was feeling unstoppable, so there was no reason for him to suspect that his next catch would get away from him. On the evening of Friday the 8th of November, whilst shopping for a gift at Fashion Palace Mall, 18-year-old Carol Daronch was approached by a handsome man with a mustache who introduced himself as Officer Roseland. Informing her that her car may have been broken into in the car park, she and the stranger went to her Chevrolet Camaro, only to find it completely untouched. Bundy then requested she jump into his Volkswagen Beetle so that they could go to the Murray Police Headquarters, which she did after he briefly flashed what she thought was police identification. He then drove her to a residential area, sharply parked up and pounced on her. In the kerfuffle that ensued, Daronch managed to open the passenger door just as he placed a handcuff on her right hand, but in the confusion he accidentally locked the other cuff on the same hand, rendering it useless. Darange fled from the car and ran away down the street, freeing herself from the grasp of her terrifying assailant. Shivering with fear, Carol Darange was picked up by a friendly passerby. Quite incredibly, by then Ted Bundy was already speeding north on Interstate 15 towards the city of Bountiful, in a depraved search for another victim. Parking up near Viewmont High School, which was putting on a performance of the musical The Redhead, he rashly entered the auditorium lobby in view of several hundred people, and after approaching a 24-year-old drama teacher, Ray Lynn Shepard, with no luck, he paced up and down the auditorium until he spotted 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent leaving mid-performance. With everyone distracted inside, Bundy knocked her out cold while she was in the car park, re-entered the auditorium slightly disheveled to make it seem he didn't leave at the same time as her, only to return to his car and unconscious victim. Bundy would confess to her murder 15 years later. With the police no closer to identifying him as the perpetrator, despite his increasingly reckless methods, that Christmas, Ted Bundy spent time with Elizabeth and her family in Utah, feeling fairly confident that he had evaded detection. Unknown to him, however, Elizabeth had heard of the Utah murder of Melissa Smith and was growing increasingly suspicious of her boyfriend. Yet she ignored the various red flags for the time being and convinced herself that her Ted, so friendly and at ease with her parents and family, wasn't capable of such atrocities. At the beginning of 1975, with the manhunt in Utah making it far too risky for him to operate there, Ted changed his hunting ground to the ski resorts of neighboring Colorado, while also turning up to his law classes in Utah in order to provide some future alibis if needed. On the 12th of January 1975, just 12 months after his murderous campaign had first commenced, 24-year-old Karen Campbell took the elevator to the second floor of the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village in Colorado in order to retrieve a magazine. It is thought that Bundy took advantage of the massive amounts of steam rising from the outdoor pool to conceal the moment he approached her as she walked the short distance to her room, which she never reached. Her body was found a month later. After the Campbell murder, Bundy took a brief trip back to see Elizabeth in Washington State, whose suspicions about him temporarily subsided. Nevertheless, when he returned to Utah, the creeping doubt set in again, prompting her to make calls to the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, expressing her concerns. Yet the detective on the other end assured her that they had already checked out Ted Bundy and found nothing to suggest he was a plausible suspect. This was despite the fact that in the first months of 1975, the bodies of many of Bundy's victims, who were just listed as missing up to that point, were discovered, potentially expanding the range of evidence available to investigators and clearly confirming that there was a serial killer on the loose, operating not just in Washington State, but in Utah and Colorado as well. After his return to law school in Utah, Bundy focused his activities on the small town of Vail, Colorado. One night there, he dressed up as a disabled man with crutches, his by now common method, and went looking for a victim. It wasn't long before he spotted 26-year-old Julie Cunningham strolling to a nearby tavern and asked her to assist him with getting to his car. She obliged a person who she thought was relatively harmless, only to quickly realize he wasn't. After hitting her over the head, handcuffing her and driving to a secluded location, Bundy choked her until she passed out, purposefully leaving the passenger door open so that when she woke up, she would think she could escape. When she did, Cunningham made a run for it, just like he wanted. He was simply toying with her. After letting her go for a short distance, he chased her down and added her to the list of his victims. A couple of weeks later, In early April 1975, 24-year-old Denise Oliverson met her end in Grand Junction, Colorado at Bundy's hands. He dumped her body in the Colorado River before heading back to Utah to send Elizabeth flowers for her 30th birthday. Worse, if that was possible, was to follow. Exactly a month after killing Oliverson, Bundy was in Pocatello, Idaho. There he happened upon Lynette Culver, a student at Alameda Junior High School who was only 12 years old. He lured her into his car and they drove back to his room at the Holiday Inn. Culver's body would never be recovered, and for many years the official status of her case was that she was missing. But in 1989, shortly before his execution, Bundy confessed to her murder. What makes all of this especially sinister is that just weeks later, Bundy was back in Seattle with Elizabeth and her young daughter Tina, who was not of a dissimilar age to Lynette Culver. As with previous occasions, Elizabeth's suspicions concerning her long-term boyfriend abated when he was present, but then resumed when he was gone, and she saw things on the news which seemed to yet again point the finger of suspicion towards Ted. For his part, Ted was soon engaged in another killing, this time in late June in Provo, Utah, when 15-year-old Susan Curtis was returning the short distance to her dorm to brush her teeth for the Bountiful Orchard Youth Conference banquet later that evening. She became the last unlucky soul to die a nightmarish death in 1975 at the hands of the monster, before he was finally identified as the probable killer. At 2 a.m. on the 15th of August 1975, Ted Bundy was parked up on the side of the road with no lights on in his car, studying a map of Salt Lake City. He was high on marijuana and intoxicated. This was not an uncommon feature of Bundy's activities, and he would later explain that he usually drank a lot while committing his crimes. On this particular evening, it would be his undoing, as Sergeant Bob Hayward of the Utah Highway Patrol approached his stationary vehicle in his patrol car whilst on the lookout for thieves. Startled by the sudden interruption, Bundy speedily drove off. Hayward swiftly followed in pursuit and soon chased Bundy down. After surveying Bundy's driving license, the police officer searched the car, finding handcuffs in the boot and a brown gym bag in the passenger seat, stuffed with the paraphernalia of kidnap and murder. This included a 7-inch nylon rope, a tan-colored ski mask with a dark stripe, a brown cotton glove with leather hand grip, a black leather ski glove, a box of trash bags, a flashlight, some 4-inch orange wire, 8 strips of white sheet material of different lengths, an ice pick, a Sears Model 6577 crowbar, and surely the most bizarre item of all, a pair of pantyhose cut with eye and nose holes to use it as a mask of some sort. Believing he had found burglary tools, Hayward arrested him and the suspect was whisked to jail, where he was photographed, while his murder kit was taken into police custody. Released in the early morning hours of Saturday the 16th of August 1975, the following Tuesday, during a weekly meeting attended by lawmakers from all the surrounding counties and states, the news of Bundy's arrest sent his name to the top of the suspect list. As investigations intensified and focused on him, lots of evidence seemed to now point in his direction. Hence, on the 21st of August 1975, Bundy was arrested again at the front door of his apartment. Over the following weeks, investigators continued to make connections between Ted Bundy and the different murder cases in Washington State, Utah, and Colorado. Obviously, the fact Bundy had moved to Utah to attend law school around the time that the focus of the murders shifted from Washington State to Utah and Colorado was incriminating. But the smoking gun really came on the 8th of September, when it was discovered that Bundy's gas receipts from his Chevron oil card matched the various locations where the crimes had occurred. Lawmakers were now certain that they had caught the killer. Now it was just a matter of threading together the grisly tapestry. On the 2nd of October, after being identified in a lineup by Carol DaRonch, Viewpoint High's drama teacher Ray Lynn Shepard, and a friend of Debbie Kent, Theodore Robert Bundy was arrested for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Carol DaRonch, setting off an unprecedented media storm in which his picture was plastered over every national newspaper. During the early stages of proceedings in late 1975, a time when Bundy was quite incredibly free after paying the $15,000 bail that had been set, but was being tracked by detectives, many of his former colleagues and friends rushed to his defense, unwilling to believe that the man they had known from various political campaigns and law schools was a serial killer. Nevertheless, one by one, each of his advocates would in time come to the shocking realization that the police were right. Meanwhile, while he waited for his day in court that had been set for late February 1976, Bundy made a show of proclaiming his innocence and wove the narrative that he was at the center of a miscarriage of justice. Despite his expressions of his own innocence, when the trial commenced, it took less than a week for Judge Stuart M. Hanson Jr. of Salt Lake County to declare that beyond a reasonable doubt, Bundy was guilty of the attempted abduction and murder of Carol DaRonch. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. While this initial conviction had gotten Bundy off the streets, it would prove to be the least of his worries, for quietly in the background, Colorado lawmakers were assembling a much larger and more comprehensive case against him that would be centered on Karen Campbell, the young woman Bundy had murdered in the Wildwood Inn in Colorado in January 1975. Having procured eyewitness testimony that placed him in the Wildwood Inn, and having also presented Bundy with the gas receipt he had signed and received at the nearby gas station on the day Campbell vanished, on the morning of the 28th of January 1977, Bundy was charged in Salt Lake County Prison with Campbell's murder. There would be more twists and turns, though. In April, Bundy announced that he was going to defend himself in the upcoming Maine trial, a move which meant he was given access to a law library. It was while there on the 7th of June 1977 that he absconded through an open window on the second floor of the Aspen courthouse. This first effort at escape, though, ended after just 5 days. At that point, Ted was stopped in a stolen car heading out of Aspen, apprehended and sent back to Garfield County Jail. Thereafter, he was forced to wear leg irons and chains in court. In December 1977, believing that being judged outside of Aspen would increase his chances of acquittal, and against his lawyer's advice, Bundy successfully sued for a change of venue for his trial to El Paso County, Colorado. Happy with himself that he had been able to persuade the judge, Bundy was shocked to be informed moments later by his lawyer that El Paso County was actually Colorado Springs, a precinct famed for the amount of death sentences it handed out to murderers. Realizing his fatal mistake, the color from his previously mirthful face drained instantly, and according to one investigator, the change was in microseconds. The man that was in the dark had just been exposed to the brilliant light of day. It was this revelation which drove Bundy to make a second escape attempt. On the 30th of December 1977, using books and clothes to simulate a person lying on his bunk, and with more than $700 of legal donations stuffed in his pockets, he struggled into the crawl space above his cell, broke into the chief jailer's empty apartment above, took some of his clothes and walked out of the front door to freedom. This second escape attempt was initially more successful than the first. Days later, Bundy was on his way across the country to Tallahassee, Florida, via a plane and several stolen vehicles. Taking an upstairs room at 409 West College Avenue and going by the name of Chris Hagen, he initially decided that he was going to get a normal job and to refrain from further acts of violence. However, the all-too-familiar violent urges soon emerged, and by mid-January 1978, he was visiting student nightclubs in Tallahassee. This eventually led him to the Chi Omega sorority house, where, after grabbing a wooden log from a woodpile and driven by animal rage, he first snuck into Margaret Bowman's room and quietly bludgeoned and strangled her, before moving shark-like into Lisa Levy's room, where she was beaten and choked as she slept. In a fit of uncontrollable madness, he had also bitten her as she lay dying, leaving behind an incriminating indentation of his teeth marks. Before he left the crime scene at 3:15 a.m. to return to his residence, he also severely battered Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas, all of whom survived. As Tallahassee awakened to the horrifying news of the attacks, Bundy joined a group of residents at his accommodation who were discussing the disturbing incident. Here, as though he could not resist tangentially boasting about his experience as a serial killer, he was overheard saying that this was probably a professional job and the guy has done it before. With Tallahassee still reeling in horror, in early February, Bundy, now looking increasingly disheveled, checked out of the Holiday Inn and cruised down to Lake City Junior High School, where his eyes fixated on 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach. According to an eyewitness who thought she was his child being punished for some wrongdoing, he brought her to the passenger side of his van, shoved her in, and then careered uncontrollably down the highway as he tried to drive and restrain Leach at the same time. Then, finding an abandoned hogshed 30 minutes later, he sexually assaulted her before murdering her. Not long after, he resolved to head over the state line to Alabama, but on the way he was spotted by Patrolman David Lee, driving through the suburb of Brownsville with no headlights on. Bundy was traveling in a stolen Volkswagen, almost as though he was taunting police by traveling in the same make of vehicle he had used when committing his murders back west in 1974 and 1975. Lee soon confirmed the car was stolen and began to arrest Bundy. As the patrolman secured one cuff, the suspect hit him in the face and tripped him before running away. But he was eventually subdued. Ted Bundy had been caught, and there would be no further escape attempts hereafter. One of the first things that Bundy did while in custody was to phone up Elizabeth Kendall. On the call, he told her that he was consumed by a sickness he couldn't comprehend. But he remained tight-lipped about the Chi Omega murders in Florida when pressed by her, as if he was too ashamed to talk about it in what would be their last ever conversation. After multiple interrogation sessions, during which he didn't directly admit his guilt but alluded to it, Ted Bundy was indicted for the Chi Omega murders in July 1978. Preparing for the upcoming trial in June 1979, he completely undermined his own cause by declining to plead insanity to save himself from the death sentence. For in Bundy's twisted mind, assault and murder were not mental aberrations at all, but something he considered to be accomplishments. If he tried to claim he was innocent by reason of insanity, he would be renouncing the murders altogether. He also rejected a plea bargain that would save him from the electric chair if he admitted in open court that he had killed Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, and Kimberly Leach. Owing to all of this, on the 23rd of July 1979, it was decreed that Bundy was guilty of the attempted murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas, as well as the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. with the matching teeth marks found on the latter's body, the prosecution's star evidence. He was subsequently sentenced to death by the electric chair. Any chance of appeal went from remote to nil the following January, when he was also found guilty of murdering Kimberly Leach. Just before he was handed another death sentence, at 10:31 a.m. on the 9th of February 1980, the 2-year anniversary of Leach's abduction, Bundy married Carol Ann Boone. She was a former work colleague from his days at the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. In the late 1970s, while he was facing numerous trials, Boone had become his girlfriend because she wholeheartedly believed in his innocence. Being unable to reconcile the idea that the individual she had worked with back in 1974 could be guilty of the crimes he stood accused of. Over the next several years, she visited him regularly and was allowed conjugal visits, such that on the 24th of October 1982, a daughter was born from their marriage. They named her Rose, Bundy's only known child. It was only in 1986, after many more revelations of her dawning realization that the man she had married on death row had in fact committed the crimes which he had been found guilty of, that Carol divorced Bundy in 1986. As he rotted on death row throughout the 1980s, Bundy became the subject of 2 of the decade's most popular bestsellers, the first being The Stranger Beside Me, written by crime reporter and former work colleague Anne Rule, who had maintained a friendship with him since the early 1970s, and the second being The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy, authored by none other than Elizabeth Kendall. While these could be viewed as cynical efforts to cash in on their authors' close relationships with one of America's most notorious serial killers, in both instances there was a genuine desire to explore how they had been so conned by Bundy. This was especially the case with Elizabeth, who doubtlessly felt she had to clear her name to some extent with public opinion, after being in a relationship with Ted throughout much of the time that he was mass murdering young women across Washington state. These were not the only revelations concerning Bundy in the 1980s. In 1984, via interviews which he agreed to give to Bob Keppel, who was investigating a catalog of murders committed by the notorious Gary Ridgway, otherwise known as the Green River Killer, some insight was given into the distorted psyche of Ted Bundy. Keppel noted the lack of remorse and hardly contained glee of Bundy when he was presented with pictures of some of the remains of his victims. Keppel also noted that Bundy sounded envious when the topic turned to the killings Ridgway had engaged in. On the 19th of November 1986, 6 hours before he was scheduled to be electrocuted for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and to the dismay of the general public, a U.S. Supreme Court judge ruled that his death penalty should be delayed while investigators re-examined his psychological state during the 1980 trial. Nevertheless, justice would eventually catch up with Bundy, and the execution was soon rescheduled for the 24th of January 1989. With the realization that he would soon die, Bundy began to talk more openly. In the 3 years before he met his maker, he admitted to multiple homicides and revealed several of his grisly habits and beliefs. These included carrying out postmortems of his victims. He also explained how he took deep, even mystical satisfaction from feeling their last breaths leave them and seeing their eyes glaze over, and how in his mind this inextricably linked them together for eternity, as he presided over them like God. On the 24th of January 1989, after a life of unimaginable cruelty, it was finally Ted Bundy's time to die. After having his hair shaved off and applied with special conducting gel just before 6 a.m., and confessing to 2 more murders, those of Susan Curtis and Denise Oliverson, He was led to the grey execution chamber at 6:57 a.m. As he was being strapped in, and as a black hood was applied to his head, Ted uttered his last words, which were directed to his lawyer Jim Coleman, who had fruitlessly tried to stay his execution at the last minute, and Fred Lawrence, the Methodist minister, who had counseled him in his final days. These were, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." At 7:06 a.m., the hooded executioner pressed a button on the electric chair. Bundy clenched his fists once and then twice. After a minute, the power was turned off, and a paramedic confirmed he had no pulse. Then the black hood was taken off by prison physician Dr. Frank Kilo to reveal lifeless, half-open eyes. "He's dead," announced Kilo to the silent room. Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Coming from a somewhat dysfunctional background, though hardly a particularly bad one. In his earliest years, Bundy's sickness was first expressed in small acts of rebellion and occasional outbursts, but some studies argue that he may have committed his first murders when he was little more than a teenager. Unfortunately for those who wish to reconstruct Bundy's life, these events in it remain shrouded in mystery. What is altogether clearer are the events of the 1970s. Having spent years drifting aimlessly between college courses and jobs, without many successes, he began to settle down to some extent in Washington state in the early 1970s, in a relationship with Elizabeth Kendall and attending law school. But unbeknownst to Elizabeth, in early 1974, he commenced a campaign as a serial killer. Over the next 4 years or so, and through multiple arrests and 2 prison escapes, he murdered over 24 young women and teenagers. Though investigators believe the number is probably over 30 for his entire lifetime. Psychologists and other analysts have tried to assess what drove Bundy and what psychological maladies drove him to do what he did. The reason this has proved so difficult is that he was clearly a complex mix of someone who was psychotic, narcissistic, had borderline personality disorder, and a range of sexual paraphilias. All of this combined in Bundy in an immensely toxic way, with the fact that he was capable of living a double life in which he appeared relatively normal to those around him, including his long-term girlfriend, but in reality was mass murdering people by night. Even when he came close to being caught on several occasions, he charmed his way out of the situation. Incredibly, on nearly every occasion that he was arrested, whether originally in 1975 or following his escapes from prison, it was actually bad driving that was his undoing. Thankfully, with the advent of DNA evidence and other technological developments over the past half-century, it is highly unlikely that anyone could ever engage in the activity which Bundy did in the 1970s and get away with it for as long as he did. What do you think of Ted Bundy? Do you think he was the most horrific serial killer to have ever lived? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The woman known to history as Countess Elizabeth Bathory de Echede, or the Blood Countess, murderer of 650 young women, was born on the 7th of August 1560 at her family estate in Nyírbátor in the east of the Kingdom of Hungary, 146 miles from Budapest. Her mother was Baroness Anna Bathory of the Szolnok branch of the family, and her father was Baron George VI Bathory of the Echede branch of the same family, which meant that her parents were blood relatives. The family had a long history, dating back to 1310, and the direct translation of the name Bathory is good hero, which is ironic given how Elizabeth has been remembered. The term good hero was a reference to a family legend involving a semi-mythical Bartari named Vetus, who slayed a dragon which had been rampaging through the countryside in the year 900, and was rewarded with the name Bartari as well as Exshed Castle, the family estate which Baron George VI came to inherit, and which was not actually built until the 1300s. The Bartari coat of arms featured 3 bared dragon teeth on a blunt red and white background as a reference to this family myth. Elizabeth Bartari spent her childhood at Exshed Castle, now known as Nagyecset or Great Exshed, in the northern Great Plain region of eastern Hungary, near the modern border with Romania. She was raised as a Calvinist Protestant and was well educated, as was appropriate for a young noblewoman from an influential family. She mastered many languages including Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek, and by many accounts was intelligent and headstrong. Throughout her childhood, she apparently suffered from seizures and complained of headaches, possibly caused by epilepsy, a condition which ran through the Bartari family tree. But at the time, epilepsy was not understood, and although Renaissance scholars began investigating the idea that epilepsy was a manifestation of physical illness, it was commonly seen as a moral or occult affliction, or as a sign of madness, and so it was hushed up. Living at the cross-section between the Middle Ages and modernity, a period termed the Renaissance by historians, Elizabeth's life was full of contradictions. She herself experienced a Renaissance-style education, as befitted a woman, but science could not yet understand her medical condition. She had taken up the relatively new Protestant faith, but came face to face with the lasting power of the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, the great power of the region. She was expected to embody the genteel idea of femininity, but was exposed to the gore of medieval punishment, war, and violence. As a young child and noblewoman, Elizabeth would have seen the violent punishments meted out on family servants and on those of a lower social order. Violence was desensitized in a way that could be hard to understand from the vantage point of the modern era. Whipping was a common form of punishment on landed estates, and the law across much of Europe handed down bloody punishments, often exceeding the level of violence of the crime itself. Limbs would be cut off for petty theft. Women suspected of witchcraft or unwomanly behavior were burnt alive or drowned. And treason, the most serious of all crimes, was punished through grotesquely invented methods of torture, intended to kill and cause maximum pain. Only a few decades before Elizabeth's birth, a peasants' revolt in 1514 was brutally suppressed, and its leader, Udger Doja, was forced to sit on a burning throne wearing a heated iron crown, watching the chopping up of his younger brother, enduring hot pliers being forced into his skin, and finally having his skin eaten by the other rebels, who faced a brutal death if they refused, before he finally died. For lesser crimes, however, punishments were decided at a local level, often by the landlord, meaning that Elizabeth and her family were both responsible for, and exposed to, the violence of medieval punishments. The Bartari family was very prominent and powerful in 16th and 17th century Hungary and Poland, as well as her baron and baroness parents. Elizabeth's uncle on her father's side, Andrew Bonaventura Bartari, was the voivoda, the highest-ranking official of Transylvania, as well as Chief Justice of Hungary. And her uncle on her mother's side, Stefan Bartari, married the Queen of Poland, becoming the famous Polish king Stefan Bartari in 1575, adding to his titles of Grand Duke of Lithuania, of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Prince of Transylvania. Several members of the Bartari family wore the title of Prince of Transylvania, throughout and after Elizabeth's lifetime, including two of her cousins, Sigismund and Gabriel Báthory. The Báthory family owned land in the Kingdom of Hungary, now Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania, and were extremely wealthy, so wealthy that they lent money to many influential families, including the Habsburgs of Austria. The Habsburgs were one of the most prominent royal families in medieval and early modern Europe, with a dynasty which stretched from 1282 to 1918, spanning a total of 636 years. The core Habsburg lands were in East Central Europe, with its capital at Vienna, in Austria. Although during Elizabeth's lifetime, the Habsburg dynastic seat was moved to Prague from 1583 to 1611. But the House of Habsburg produced kings of several countries, including Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, Galicia or Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, which therefore brought their respective colonies to under Habsburg control. The Habsburgs also claimed, though later in history, several principalities in Italy and the Low Countries, as well as the 19th century emperors of Austria and Austria-Hungary, and even an emperor of Mexico. The family expanded its power through war and fortuitous marriages, but split into several branches, most significantly in the mid-16th century, when the Spanish and Austrian branches were divided after Charles V abdicated. The long-term Habsburg strategy of using intermarriage to maintain close diplomatic relations between its family branches dangerously reduced the family gene pool, resulting in disabilities and deformities, including the infamously oversized Habsburg jaw. The Habsburgs reached the zenith of their power in the late 1500s, during Elizabeth's lifetime, holding the title of Holy Roman Emperor for 368 years, from 1438 to 1806, with only a small gap in between, from 1740 to 1745. The Habsburgs were then the most powerful royal family, ruling over the most powerful state in Europe in the Middle Ages. Although this single family dominated the position for centuries, the Holy Roman Emperor was actually elected, admittedly only by the elites, the prince-elects. Though the Habsburgs did have a significant advantage in that Habsburg land made up a large portion of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire encompassed modern-day Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, the Low Countries, Slovenia, and parts of eastern France, northern Italy, western Poland, and northern Croatia. The empire saw itself as the rightful inheritor of the legacy of Imperial Rome, and promoted the Roman Catholic faith brutally throughout its territories. It was in the Holy Roman Empire that Protestantism first arose, when Martin Luther pinned his 95 Theses or protests on a church door in Wittenberg, in modern Germany, in 1517. A country in East Central Europe in the Middle Ages like Hungary would have to contend with the great power of the Holy Roman Empire, and also that of the House of Habsburg. The lives of the Hungarian nobility were often blighted by the whims of these powerful neighbors in the West. And after 1453, another threat lay in the East. Throughout Elizabeth's lifetime, Hungary suffered the consequences of being surrounded by dangerous and powerful neighbors, from the menacing power of the House of Habsburg to the frequent incursions from the Ottoman Turks. In the 16th century, external events would dramatically impact domestic events in Hungary, and as a result, would have huge personal consequences for the life of Elizabeth Báthory. In 1490, Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, a Renaissance king who was known as Matthias the Just, died, and Hungary was left in decline. In 1453, the Turks had taken Constantinople, bringing an end to the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, protector of the Orthodox Catholic faith, and the whole region around the Balkans had been left shaken. King Matthias had created a mercenary army known as the Black Army, to keep Hungary strong during a period of huge uncertainty and tension, but his death brought the progress achieved under his reign to an abrupt end. His successors as King of Hungary were selected by a diet or national assembly of important nobles. The nobility's preference for a weak king that could be easily controlled provided the opportunity for Turkish ruler Suleiman the Magnificent to seize part of Hungary after a rousing victory at Mohacs in 1526, during which the city of Buda was burned down, and the Hungarian king at the time, Ulászló II, was slain in battle. The throne of Hungary was then fought over between Ferdinand I, Archduke of Austria and later Holy Roman Emperor, who wanted to claim Hungary for the Habsburg Empire, and János Zápolya, voivode of Transylvania and commander of what remained of Hungary's army. Archduke Ferdinand relied on his impressive aristocratic connections to lay claim to the throne of Hungary. He was the brother-in-law of the previous king and brother to the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Yet the Hungarian nobility were divided. The two branches of the Báthory family chose to support different sides in the struggle for power. The Somlyó Báthories that formed Elizabeth's maternal line supported János, the voivode, while the Ecsed Báthories of Elizabeth's father backed the Habsburg Archduke in hopes of support against the Turks, whom Hungary had been attempting to hold back for over a century. Both János and Ferdinand were elected as king by rival factions of the Hungarian nobility and lesser gentry. Elizabeth's father George swapped sides to support János, perhaps due to the rising influence of Anna's brother Stefan and the opportunity to strengthen the power of the Báthory line. The Habsburgs stripped George of his castle Buják in retaliation, as George cemented his new alliance by marrying Anna. The two sides of the Báthory family were now united, but the anger of the Habsburgs at this betrayal was to be long-lasting. János ruled Hungary through a turbulent period of peasant uprisings, the capture of Buda, and seizure of Western Hungary by Archduke Ferdinand, had an ill-fated alliance with the Turks. When János died in 1541, Hungary was partitioned into three entities: Habsburg Royal Hungary, which bordered Austria in the west; Ottoman Hungary, which included central and southern Hungary; and the semi-independent Principality of Transylvania in the east. Elizabeth Báthory was born in the Principality of Transylvania, where elected Hungarian princes ruled often as vassals under either the Ottoman Sultan or the Habsburgs, and her life was greatly impacted by both military conflicts against the Turks and by the machinations of the Habsburgs, who continued to rule part and later all of Hungary until 1918. Transylvania, where much of the Báthory family's power was based, prospered despite the tumultuous conditions. The princes of Transylvania had their power guaranteed by a constitution and were seen as representatives of the three historic nations: the Hungarians, Saxons, and Hungarian-speaking Czechots. Although trapped between the Muslim Turks and Catholic Habsburgs, Transylvania was also spared the religious strife common in the period, as the country's princes often promoted religious tolerance. The nobility and many of its princes, though notably not Elizabeth's uncle, Prince of Transylvania Stefan Báthory, who was Roman Catholic, were Calvinist Protestants, and Protestantism flourished in Transylvania. The Edict of Torda in 1568 gave religious freedom to the Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Unitarian churches, though the Romanian or Vlach nation and its Greek Orthodox faith were excluded. This edict represented the first legal guarantee of religious freedom in Christian Europe. The royal house of Báthory officially came to power in 1571, when the first Báthory, Stefan, ruled as voivode, then as prince, in 1576, under first Ottoman and then Habsburg suzerainty. It was during the Bartaried reign that the Principality of Transylvania became a semi-independent state, with relative independence outside of foreign affairs, which were controlled by its powerful neighbors. Under Sigismund Bartary, who served as Prince of Transylvania several times between 1586 and 1602, it entered the long Turkish War from 1593 to 1606, another stage of the two-century-long struggle known as the Ottoman-Habsburg War, which lasted from 1526 to 1791. The country formed part of the Christian alliance against the Turks, but the conflict also represented a four-way struggle, with the Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and another semi-independent region, Wallachia, now a region of southern Romania, with Transylvania falling, for a short time, under the control of Habsburg Rudolf I after 1601, who attempted to Germanize the population and revive Catholicism in the region. Rebellion against Habsburg rule, led by Hungarian nobleman Stefan Bocskai, saw Transylvania enlarged and re-empowered, but religious tensions and military campaigns between Transylvania and the Habsburgs were not at an end, and holding power in Transylvania was a dangerous balancing act. As the Bartary family was keen to expand the family's influence further, Elizabeth was engaged to Count Ferenc II Nádasdy at the age of 10, and sent, as was the tradition at the time, to live with the family of her husband to be at a castle Szarvár in West Hungary near the Austrian border, now known as Nádasdy Castle. It was around the time that she was at Szarvár in her young teenage years that the first possible controversy about Elizabeth surfaced, although the rumor actually originated long after her death. It was said that she had had a relationship with a man of lower social status and had born a child out of wedlock. When Count Nádasdy found out, he is said to have had the man castrated and thrown to a pack of hungry dogs to be torn apart while he was still alive. The child, possibly a girl, was said to have been spirited away or even murdered at Nádasdy's orders. However, this story is made questionable by the contemporary letters which praised Elizabeth's chastity, particularly later in her life when her husband was away at war. And if the story was true, it tells us much about the power and influence of the Bartary family to have successfully forced through the union, even after the damage to their daughter's reputation. At the age of 15, Elizabeth was married to Count Ferenc II Nádasdy on the 8th of May 1575 at the palace of Vranov nad Topriol, which is in eastern Slovakia today. The marriage was a political arrangement between two old and important aristocratic families. The importance of Elizabeth's own family is shown by the fact that she kept her own surname, Bartary de Ecshed, rather than becoming a Nádasdy. The Count and Elizabeth had several children, and it is commonly understood that many of her children died before reaching adulthood, and that only two daughters and a son reached maturity: Anna, Katalin, and Paul. Elizabeth's children were raised, as she herself had been, by a governess, and there was a good reason for this. Elizabeth spent much of her married life managing her husband's estate, as well as her own, while he was away as a commander of Hungarian troops in the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars, a war that Transylvania had again become involved in when it renounced its vassalship to the Ottomans in the bid for full independence. As her husband left in 1578 and did not return for several years, Elizabeth took on the full management of her husband's business affairs and their estates, and historical records have shown that Elizabeth was generally very successful at this. Her tasks involved defending her husband's estates, which were on the route to Vienna, an important Habsburg city, even though it was not, at that time, the dynastic seat, providing medical care across the region, and intervening on the behalf of destitute women who had lost their husbands and therefore their financial security in the war. Assessing the relations between landlords, their tenants, and the local people can be difficult, but surveying surviving letters of complaint and petitions is often the best way to determine how vassals and local people felt about their landlords. These written documents were the main form of complaint when grievances arose, whether from petty theft or something more serious, such as accusations of bodily harm. However, no letters of complaint, neither hinting at the torture she supposedly subjected local girls to, nor over minor grievances like the cost of the manorial taxes paid to the Barteries, have survived from this period, which could suggest that Elizabeth's tenants and the local people were content with her rule. While away fighting in the Ottoman-Habsburg War, Count Nardoshta built a reputation for effective command and fearless bravery, assisting in the seizure of several Ottoman-held castles, including Ejtegom, on the hilly banks of the Danube northwest of Budapest, in 1595. He was also known for his fierce cruelty to Ottoman prisoners of war, with some stories outlining his grotesque defilement of the corpses of those who had died under torture, including playing catch with their decapitated heads, though the poor and violent treatment of captured enemy combatants, particularly non-Christians, was commonplace at this time. Upon his return from the war, it is said that Nardoshti taught Elizabeth methods of torture he had perfected in his army days and advised her on dishing out inhumane punishments to their servants, including coating a young girl in honey and leaving her outside to be bitten by ants and putting lit oiled paper between her toes. Although undoubtedly inspired by her husband's bloodlust, the majority of the violent crimes for which Elizabeth was accused were committed later, after her husband's death. Stories of the way in which Elizabeth herself treated those who served her are perhaps not surprising, considering that relations between masters and servants at the time was so often fraught with violence. A tale of Elizabeth striking a servant for accidentally tugging at her hair with a brush is really not far out of the common way. And as a noble, Elizabeth legally had the right to do as she wished to the peasants under her rule. Even murdering a servant would only have resulted in a fine to allow financial compensation to be offered to the victim's family. Indeed, once charges were brought against Elizabeth, as we will soon discuss, it was her responsibility for the deaths of noble children, not violence against her servants or members of the lower social classes, which were seen as immoral crimes and formed the most serious of the charges. This is not to say, of course, that tales of Elizabeth's cruelty to her female servants were untrue. They are just difficult accusations to prove, given the lack of evidence. Stories spread at the time saying that Elizabeth took pleasure in causing pain and had been delighted by her husband's gift of a black claw, reminiscent of the dragon which featured in her family's founding myth, which she strapped to her hand to claw at the skin of her victims. She apparently also enjoyed pushing needles under the nails of her poorest servant girls, and responded to any signs of laziness or ineptitude with extreme violence, including breaking the arm of one such unlucky servant, as though to emphasize that a woman could not possibly commit such acts of evil alone. Elizabeth's connections were caught up in the rumors. There were unsubstantiated claims that she was taught about Satanism and witchcraft by family members at a young age. But it was not witchcraft, a common accusation against rebellious women at the time, which Elizabeth was to be charged with, but torture and murder. One woman in particular was said to have inspired Elizabeth's bloodlust. Anna Darvulia, known as Darvulia, had long been a servant of the Nardoshta family, but rose to a prominent position in 1601 as Elizabeth's confidant. It was said that Darvulia taught Elizabeth everything she knew about methods of inflicting pain, and had instructed the other servants on how best to assist the Countess in her torture sessions. These servants later claimed that when Darvulia arrived, the lady herself became crueler and crueler. It was around this time, between the rise of Daravulia's influence and the slow decline of her husband's health in the early 1600s, that Elizabeth began luring young girls from the lesser gentry to join her gynoeceum, or women's quarters. A gynoeceum in the 1500s was not the same as the women's quarters of ancient Greece, where the term gynoeceum originated from. In ancient times, women would live the majority of their married lives in private, their gynoeceum providing them with a completely separate sphere from men, and a place for women of the household to gather together, complete chores and leisure activities, and learn important womanly crafts. In 16th century Hungary, the gynoeceum was a place for the women of the household to gather, but often also included unmarried young women who came sometimes great distances to learn. In the women's quarters of influential noblewomen, girls and young women would learn courtly etiquette, be taught the dance steps they would need to prosper in court and attract a respectable husband, learn how to manage a grand household, and practice foreign languages, something which would have been especially important in Hungary, given that it was a country sandwiched between powerful neighbors, where illustrious matches would require fluency in at least German and Hungarian. Needlecraft, reading, playing musical instruments, games, and other leisure activities would also have been part of the daily routine for the women. Elizabeth, who had mastered at least 4 languages in her youth and had married a very respectable man, would have been seen as the ideal noblewoman to instruct these young women of the lesser gentry. But Elizabeth's gynoeceum had another function. It was said that she had lured these young women to her castles to torture them. No longer satisfied with torturing her servants and running out of new victims in the local area, Elizabeth drew in the daughters of the lesser gentry with her status and promises of social advancement. Although it was certainly not out of the ordinary for an intelligent noblewoman like Elizabeth to take in and educate unmarried young women, what did raise suspicion were the numerous deaths which occurred amongst the young women in her care. Stories of cruelty, including starvation, began to spread as strange injuries and disappearances plagued the gynoeceum. After several of the young women there died, Elizabeth announced that a cholera outbreak had been to blame, but the number of bodies brought for burial in the local churchyard and the frequency with which the local priests were called made an investigation into the matter almost inevitable. However, while her husband was alive, Elizabeth was shielded from open criticism and accusations. Count Nadezhda died on the 4th of January 1604. After 29 years of marriage to Elizabeth, he had suffered from debilitating pain in his leg, perhaps caused by his wartime experiences, which left him permanently disabled in 1603. Although the exact cause of his death is unknown, the Count left his widow and heirs under the care of György Thurzó, who was a powerful Hungarian magnate and palatine of Hungary, which made him the representative of the monarch from 1609 to 16. Despite being given this responsibility of care for Elizabeth and her children, it was Thurzó who would eventually lead the investigation into Elizabeth's crimes. Tellingly, Elizabeth had been left to manage the family's wealth and lands, as her son was still an infant, which made her a lucrative target. Elizabeth's downfall began in 1602 when rumors began to spread of the horrific crimes she had committed. By 1602, the priests on her estates began to question the number of servants and young ladies at her gynoeceum who were dying from what Elizabeth said was cholera. Elizabeth reportedly prevented the priests from examining the victims' bodies, allowing them only to look at the victims' faces, which fueled further rumors. Nadezhda's reputation and political connections had protected her before his death. And even after 1604, Elizabeth's own power and wealth kept her safe for a while. The first to speak out against her publicly was a Lutheran minister, Istvan Magyar, who denounced her both in public and at the Habsburg court in Vienna. Soon the rumors were taken up as fact, and word spread that Elisabeth was a serial killer and torturer of young women. In October 1610, Elisabeth retreated to the isolated Cheta castle, now called Chachtica, in the mountains of Slovakia, approximately 50 miles from Bratislava, presumably hoping that by the time moves were made to arrest her, the steep roads to Cheta would be impassable due to winter storms and snow. Elisabeth prepared to wield the considerable influence of the Báthory family if she was to be charged, and was already in correspondence with her cousin Gabriel Báthory, the Prince of Transylvania, from 1608 to 1613. A formal investigation into Elisabeth's crimes was launched in 1610 when King Matthias II asked Thurzo, his representative as the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate Elisabeth. Letters sent between Thurzo and the notaries on the case, Andras Korasturi and Moses Chiraki, show that 52 witness statements against Elisabeth were collected by October 1610, and that this number had risen dramatically to over 300 by 1611. There were, of course, political motivations behind the investigation into Elisabeth. Historians have argued throughout the centuries about the crimes of Elisabeth Báthory, and particularly in recent years as to whether she was the victim of a conspiracy. There are three arguments commonly made which suggest that Elisabeth was set up, the first relating to money, the second, and perhaps the most convincing, power, and the third, religion. It is possible that Elisabeth's excessive wealth and land ownership in the much fought-over Principality of Transylvania, and her relative vulnerability as a widow, made her an easy and lucrative target. But the financial motive was even more personal for the Habsburg Matthias, as Count Nadezhda had lent Matthias's predecessor a great deal of money, and Matthias had reluctantly inherited the debt. Elisabeth had reportedly traveled to Matthias's court several times in an attempt to call in this debt, a move which irritated Matthias and failed to result in any payments. The fact that this debt was cancelled after Elisabeth was arrested shows the importance of money to the investigation. The Habsburg-Báthory relationship was extremely strained, even without the debt. The influence of Elisabeth's family in the region represented a threat to the political interests of the Habsburgs, who desired control over Transylvania, and sought to lessen the influence of both the Ottomans and the powerful local nobility. Matthias II, a Habsburg and brother of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II and a future Holy Roman Emperor himself, had been pronounced King of Hungary in 1608, but Hungary was still partitioned, and there were frequent attempts by local nobles to break away from Habsburg hegemony and revive their rights to elect their own kings. One of these rebellions, which had aimed to reassert Transylvania's independence, had been led by Sigismund Báthory, Elizabeth's cousin, who was later jailed for conspiracy against the emperor in 1610 to 1611, and Elizabeth had spoken out in support of her cousin. Equally, another cousin, Gabriel Báthory, then Prince of Transylvania, had his eye on expanding his territory into royal Hungarian lands, and Elizabeth had pledged to support him financially and provision him with troops. At the same time as investigating Elizabeth, Thurzo was attempting to negotiate peace with Gabriel Báthory, and was well aware of the damaging impact that removing Elizabeth from the political field would have on her cousin's cause. Perhaps Elizabeth's family were targeted because they were Protestant at a time when Protestant Catholic tensions were escalating in the run-up to the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. This war would see the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II attempt to impose Roman Catholicism on his domains, including in Transylvania. and would spark violent rebellion from the Protestants of Eastern and Central Europe. The difference in religion may have heightened the tension between the Bartaries and the Catholic Habsburgs, but several of Elizabeth's relatives, including her uncle King Stefan Báthory of Poland, were Catholic, and the suggestion that the investigation was a Catholic Habsburg plot against the Calvinist Protestant Elizabeth ignores the fact that the first accusations were made by a Lutheran minister. Perhaps religious differences can explain why few went to Elizabeth's defense once accusations were made, but this ignores the fact that religious toleration was much more common in Transylvania at this time than in the rest of the region. The argument that the investigation against Elizabeth was motivated by religious differences seems far less convincing than the motives of money and power. On the 30th of December 1610, the investigation was ramped up, and Turozo arrested Elizabeth and 5 suspected accomplices, all of them servants, at Certa Castle for torture and multiple murders carried out between 1590 and 1610. Although it was later said that Turozo had caught Elizabeth in the act of torturing a young girl in her torture chamber, Elizabeth was actually arrested while eating an evening meal at the dinner table with several guests. Despite Turozo's declaration that he had caught her red-handed, a claim preserved through time in a letter he had written to his wife, Elizabeth had been arrested and detained before the discovery of any victims, therefore leaving open the possibility that she was set up. Turozo's open statement that he had found a dead girl and another kept alive as prey in the castle whipped up the villagers and spurred further rumors of Elizabeth's crimes. Given that no physical evidence of this bloody scene was presented at trial, it can be argued that Turozo deliberately misrepresented or even completely fabricated the horror scene of dead and wounded patients which he classified as Elizabeth's victims. Turozo certainly had much to gain from Elizabeth's downfall. Not only the chance to seize her estates and wealth, to which he had tenuous rights as the guardian of her and her children, as appointed by her dying husband, but also to further his political career. By January 1611, the case was brought to trial. The witness testimonies formed a central part of the trial, but the majority of the witnesses gave only second-hand testimonies. It was reported that the majority of Elizabeth's victims had been girls aged 10 to 14 years old, who had, as members of the lesser gentry, been sent to Elizabeth's gyneceum to receive instruction from the Countess. Some witnesses named relatives who had died at the gyneceum, or reported seeing traces of torture on dead bodies in the graveyards and other unmarked locations. Of the 3 first-hand testimonies offered during the trial, 2 came from 2 court officials, Benedict Deseo and Jakub Thirashi, who claimed to have personally witnessed the Countess torture and kill young servant girls. One of the court officials stated that a servant girl had been found to have burns on her hands, but no explanation or evidence was offered as to whether these burns were the result of a kitchen accident or of malicious torture by a demented mistress. No physical evidence or corroborating testimonies were presented to confirm anything stated in these reports by the court officials. The third first-hand testimony came from an injured girl apparently found at the scene, named Anna, who testified that the Countess had hurt her and damaged her hand and arm. But the fact that she was later awarded 50 gold pieces, 15 pounds of wheat, at a small farm in Certa, and had twice changed her story about how her arm had been hurt, casts doubt on her testimony. At the trial of Elizabeth's accomplices, it was reported that there had been 650 victims, but this statistic came solely from the testimony of a servant girl named Susanna, who claimed that court official Jakub Thirassi had seen the number in one of Elizabeth's private books but could not confirm this herself. The book was never revealed to the court, and Phil Rassi himself did not mention it in his own testimony. The number of victims more commonly reported in the trial was between 50 and 60. Given that the majority of the evidence came from hearsay, and that no physical evidence was presented, it can be hard to know whether Elizabeth was actually guilty of any or all of the crimes for which she was punished. Further confusion from the trial was caused by the testimonies of Elizabeth's servants and accomplices. Two servants, Ilona Yo, the former wet nurse for the Countess's children, and her friend Dorothea Sentesh, confessed under torture to being accomplices in Elizabeth's crimes. However, these testimonies are invalid in modern eyes, as they were extracted under duress. Both women had their fingers torn out with a pair of red-hot pincers and were then buried alive. Another servant, Janos Oivari, was executed, though in a less painful manner, due to his youth and most likely his gender, and his body joined that of Yo and Sentesh on the pyre. A fourth servant, Ertsi Mayorova, who was denounced as a witch and apparently told Elizabeth to lure young noblewomen for torture when she ran out of local victims, was burnt alive after being recaptured following an escape attempt. And a fifth, Katharina Benichka, an elderly washerwoman who was also an accomplice, was only given a life sentence in prison after it was proved that she had been abused by the other servant women. The sixth and more sinister figure said to have been involved in the torture and murders was Elizabeth's companion Anna Darvolia, or Darvolia, who had died before the arrests were made. But the other servants admitted under torture that it was Darvolia who had taught Elizabeth witchcraft and demonic methods of torture. Any kernel of truth to be found in these claims against Darvolia is hidden by the brutal tactics used to extract this information from the accused, and it seems likely that the other servants simply found the deceased Darvolia an easy target to blame. It was only later, during the torturous interrogations, that Elizabeth's servants began to blame the Countess herself for the horrific crimes. While her servants began pointing the finger of blame at her, Elizabeth aimed to clear her name by asking the mother of a deceased girl from her gynaeceum to make a statement that her daughter had died from natural causes. After her claims that cholera had killed the girls at her gynaeceum were rejected, she at first blamed one of the girls for killing the others, then openly blamed all unexplained deaths and injuries on her servants, claiming that their sadism was beyond her control because even she was afraid of them. Yet it was too late to stop the rumors that were swirling against her. The second-hand testimonies detailing the torture methods which Elizabeth used on the young women in her care sparked further rumors and gossip. Word went around that Elizabeth and her accomplices had used hot tongs, needles, and freezing water to harm the young girls and her own servants. It was said that Elizabeth took such pleasure from these tortures that she would use her teeth to tear away the skin of her victims and bathe in the blood of her young victims as a youth-enhancing beauty regime. It was said that as her crimes escalated, so too did the network which she used to facilitate them, as well as the servants implicated in Elizabeth's crimes. Noble women such as Lady Anna Velika, Lady Judith Pogan, and Lady Shell were also accused of luring girls to Elizabeth's gynaeceum once her supply of local female servants had dried up. Elizabeth's youngest daughter, Katalin, was also alleged to have participated in at least one torture session at Cheta Castle, where it was rumored that Elizabeth had installed a torture chamber in the dungeons. Yet, it was only the servants who were ever called to trial. Elizabeth herself was never called to trial, and although 2 trials had been held after her arrest to unpick her crimes, and passed judgment on her accomplices on the 2nd of January 1611 and 7th of January 1611. She was denied her rights as a noblewoman to attend court lawsuits and receive judgment. Instead, her son Paul and two of her sons-in-law, Nicola Zrinski and Jurj Druget, negotiated with Turzo to avoid the loss or bartery property to the crown. Letters between the Zrinski and Turzo show that the plan had been to send her to a nunnery. But after the scandal became public, it was decided that she would be kept under strict house arrest in her isolated castle at Ceata. But King Matthias, keen to reduce the power of this powerful Transylvanian family, was displeased with this deal. Although the king had initially wanted her to stand trial so he could seize her land and wealth, King Matthias finally agreed to the punishment of house arrest. Turzo had worked hard to convince the king that house arrest was the more prudent punishment for a Hungarian noblewoman of Elizabeth's status and fame, given the nasty precedents that a trial and execution could set, including for Turzo himself, who was from the Hungarian nobility and was also a Protestant. Wary of alienating the already rebellious nobility of Transylvania, King Matthias agreed to house arrest rather than a formal trial if his debts to the Bartari family were cancelled, a request which was complied with by Elizabeth's son Paul. The conditions of Elizabeth's house arrest are hazy. It was later said that she was kept in a bricked-up room, but this idea is undermined by the presence of a bodyguard in her apartment and rumors of an escape attempt. In many accounts, whether confined to a bricked-up room or free to wander around the castle, Elizabeth's years under house arrest were spent, as her earlier years had been, in lavish surroundings, with servants attending to her needs and wants. Elizabeth died on the 21st of August 1614, aged 54, at Ceata Castle in the Kingdom of Hungary. She died while still under house arrest and, because she had never been brought to trial, succeeded in leaving her estates, lands and possessions to her children. Other than the historical damage to the family's reputation, the greatest loss that the Bartari family suffered over Elizabeth's crimes was the forced renunciation of King Matthias's debts, a sizable amount of money and interest that was never repaid to the Bartari family. Elizabeth's body was reportedly moved from the local cemetery at Ceata after the villagers caused an uproar at the presence of a serial killer in their graveyard. The new location of Elizabeth's body has never been discovered. Perhaps she was interred in a nameless grave in the Bartari family crypt at her childhood home of Ecshed Castle, or at her birth home of Nyírbátor. Or perhaps the rumors that she was secretly reburied deep in the church area of Ceata Castle are to be believed. However, when a possible grave in the crypt of Ceata Church was opened in 1938, it was found to be empty. Elizabeth's final resting place, like the question of the extent of her guilt, remains lost to history. Saying it is difficult to find out about the extent of Elizabeth's alleged crimes is an understatement. The first written accounts of Elizabeth's story were penned over 100 years after her death, and the only first-hand evidence used in the trials and later published came from Jurj Turzo and his team. To make matters even more complicated, myths have been added on top of myths, with blood bathing and claims of vampirism particularly obscuring the real crimes committed. The myth that she bathed in the blood of her young victims to retain her youth first appeared in print in Tragica Historia by Jesuit scholar Laszlo Turozzi in 1729, which was the first written account of the Bartari case. This myth seems to have circulated amongst the superstitious local peasantry and was written down uncritically by Turozzi. The myth was later repeated and published much more widely around Europe. In Hungarian historian Matthias Bell's account in 1742, which quoted directly from Tarotsis. By the time that actual reports from the trial were published for the first time in 1817, the tales of Elizabeth's unnatural, demonic thirst for blood had set in. Although neither the blood drinking nor blood bathing were mentioned in the trial scripts, these myths have lasted throughout history. The rise of Bathory's bloodthirsty reputation coincided with the vampire scares that haunted Europe in the early 18th century. Vampires had always had a prominent place in Eastern European folklore since the medieval period. However, during the 17th and 18th centuries, famine, disease, and social instability gave rise to new levels of fear and tension, which culminated in a renewed belief in the supernatural and in old superstitions. It may have been the age of reason, but the belief in vampires was so widespread that the Austro-Hungarian government undertook official reports on vampire outbreaks across Eastern Europe, and scholars wrote academic papers on the phenomenon. Witchcraft, magic, miracles, and possession by evil spirits were other common explanations for the terrible things that happened in this tumultuous period. But it was the vampire, the activities of a living corpse, which inflamed the imagination of Eastern European people. The first vampires to transcend the world of oral folklore and appear in the pages of literary works appeared in 18th century poetry, and they soon became the central figures of Gothic fiction. When John William Polidori published his The Vampire in 1819, a short story which had come from the contest between Polidori, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley, the same contest from which Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein came. The macabre tastes in literature in the 18th and early 19th centuries resulted in a caricature of Elizabeth, which conceals as much about her as it reveals. The focus on vampirism in retellings of her story has led to the sexualization and demonization of Elizabeth. From rumors of lesbianism to the determined tracing of satanic teachings through her family tree and acquaintances. Perhaps these stories of demonic cults and sinister connections originated from the common belief at the time that women were not capable of violence for its own sake. Or perhaps thinking of her as a supernatural and demonic monster was easier to palate than the realization that an ordinary woman might commit such crimes. As well as her gender, Elizabeth's class has certainly had an impact on the story of the Blood Countess. The idea of a noble woman abusing her aristocratic power and literally draining the blood of the poor would have struck a powerful note with popular and national European movements at the time. The literary obsession with depicting Eastern European counts and countesses as bloodthirsty vampires in their Gothic, isolated castles is so commonplace that it has become a cliché. It has also been suggested that Elizabeth provided inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, along with Vlad the Impaler, three-time voivode of Wallachia, Romania. And although her association with both Transylvania and crimes of the blood made Elizabeth a natural subject for vampire tales, there is no evidence that she was truly an inspiration for Dracula, as there is no mention of her in Stoker's notes. But her epithets, the Blood Countess and Countess Dracula, have determined her legend. The modern world seems determined to remember Elizabeth as the Bloody Countess. Numerous films have presented her as a vampiress-type character, from her appearance in Necropolis in 1970 to Blood Countess in 2015, and she was labeled by Guinness World Records in 2018 as the most prolific female murderer. Despite the lack of physical evidence and reliance on hearsay, the gory, sensational, and often sexualized nature of Elizabeth's story has often outweighed the search for evidence. Her work as an educator of young girls, as a countess and supporter of war widows, and her own intellectual achievements have been hugely overshadowed by these rumors of barbarity that can never be proved or disproved. While it is certain that Elizabeth lived at a time when wealthy, powerful, and isolated women were targeted with accusations of witchcraft and demon worship, the extent of her supposed crimes seems almost too large to have been entirely made up. Assessing Elizabeth Bathory is a difficult task because much of what is known about her is based on rumor and hearsay. On the one hand, it seems likely that Elizabeth was caught up in a conspiracy. No physical evidence of torture or murder was presented at the trials, and Elizabeth herself never gave testimony. The trials relied heavily on hearsay evidence, and the investigation in the first place was ordered and carried out by two men with much to gain from Elizabeth's conviction: King Matthias II, who wanted his debts cleared and to increase his control over the semi-independent Transylvania, and Ulrich Sturzo, who had his eye on Elizabeth's wealth and estates. Elizabeth's own story is overshadowed by the political motivations of those around her, and little is known about her beyond her supposed crimes. On the other hand, it seems incontrovertible that Elizabeth was unusually cruel to her servants, and that too many young daughters of the gentry died in her care to have been caused by accident or epidemic. Although the figure 650 is likely a gross exaggeration of the number of women killed by the Blood Countess, perhaps the real figure is closer to the 50 which was referenced more often in the trial, making Elizabeth a prolific serial killer, but not a mass murderer of epic proportions as she has sometimes been portrayed. The Blood Countess myths that grew up around Elizabeth have no doubt flourished more because she was from Transylvania than because she was actually a blood-drinking, blood-bathing, mass-murdering psychopath. But the answers to the questions of who the real Elizabeth Bathory was, and how many people she actually tortured and killed, will never be uncovered, as macabre rumors have long filled the gaps left by limited historical evidence. What do you think of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess? Was she guilty of 600 grisly murders, or was she merely an unusually sadistic but powerful woman who had many enemies? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much.